He remembered the sky before it turned red. It had been quiet that morning, not peaceful, just quiet, the kind of silence that feels like waiting. Dust drifted through the broken air vents of their shelter, catching the sun like falling embers. Somewhere above, machines still groaned in the mines. His mother moved without speaking. She always did. And in the stillness, the boy began to feel something strange. A pressure in the air, a shape in the silence. Like the moon itself had stopped breathing. He didn't know what war was. Not yet. He only knew that something was coming, and no one would stop it. This is the story of Darth Glovoc, the Sith who was born from silence, not fire. The boy who was forgotten by the Jedi and remembered by the darkness. Jugga's Edge was never supposed to be part of the war. It was a mining colony, barely held together by dust, welds, and unspoken rules. Refugees from a dozen broken systems came here to disappear. Families who had survived Sith raids. Survivors of Republic bombings. Those who trusted no one and expected nothing. The child's mother was one of them. Her hands were ruined from years of blast furnace labor. Her lungs weakened from poisoned air. But she never left. She couldn't. Not with him. And so they stayed, deep in the veins of a dying moon, far from Jedi and Sith alike, until the war found them anyway. The Jedi claimed they had intelligence. A hidden Sith enclave, buried beneath the crater line. Encrypted transmissions. Traitor cells. A threat. The Republic authorized the strike. One fleet. No warning. Complete orbital bombardment. The sky turned red before it made a sound. She ran without thinking. Pulled the boy through the sub-level vents, past screaming workers and collapsing stone. Down into a forgotten shaft, one she had once helped dig. There, in the dark, she sealed the hatch behind them. No light, no time. Only the sound of the world ending above. The boy didn't scream. He barely breathed, his face buried against her chest, his ears full of her heartbeat. And then, even that began to fade. For 3 days, they lay beneath the rubble. No food, no water, no sense of time. Only the scent of ash and rusted blood. When the roof groaned, she held it up with her back. When the air thinned, she tore her clothes to wrap his face. And when her body gave out, she gave him the last breath she could spare. They found him by accident. A survey team sent to catalog civilian casualties opened the hatch. Inside, they found only silence, a small boy, a still body beside him, and no reaction. He did not cry. He did not speak. He only looked at the Jedi and turned away. They labeled it a mistake. Wrong target. No Sith presence confirmed. Regrettable loss of life. Then they left. The boy remained in recovery camps for several months. He was scanned, watched, studied. There were signs of Force sensitivity, but no temple accepted him. Too quiet, too strange. He did not speak for nearly a year, but the Force was already listening, and something in it had begun to listen back. He didn't speak for 6 months, not because of trauma, not because he didn't understand how, but because the words had nowhere to go. They floated inside him like dust trapped in sunlight, present but meaningless. The camps were crowded. Dozens of children moved between crates and tents, most too young to remember what they'd lost. But not him. He remembered everything. The sound of metal cracking above them when the shaft ceiling buckled. The way her body blocked the falling stone. The way her breathing slowed and stopped, but her arms never let go. He remembered the color of her skin under ash. The way no one had come until it was too late. And the Jedi, the ones who called it a mistake. They never looked at him like a person, only a case number, a datapad entry, force-sensitive but unremarkable. They spoke of protocols, age brackets, risk factors. The boy listened to all of it, never blinking, never moving. He understood. He wasn't here to be helped. He was here to be forgotten. So he learned how to vanish. He moved silently through the relief center on Ord Talavos, eating when others didn't notice, sleeping when no one was watching. He mimicked the sounds of the walls, the hum of generators, the creak of cables. When questioned, he stayed still, not defiant, not afraid, just quiet. There was one Jedi who came more than once. A knight, young, tired. He didn't wear robes, just the utility gear of someone too long on assignment. He brought ration packs and small toys, hoping for a reaction. But the boy never reached for them, only looked at the man's belt at the hilt of the lightsaber, worn and scorched near the emitter. He stared at it, not with desire, but with recognition. The boy had seen it before, in his dreams, in the fire. The Jedi said nothing. He placed the ration packs near the cot, then left, and never returned. Eventually, they moved him, transported him to a quieter sector, farther from the front. Less chaos, fewer eyes. The staff were civilian, now Republic caretakers assigned to low-risk orphans. They tried gentle voices, stories, comfort. He didn't listen to their words. He listened to the gaps between them. At night, when others slept, he sat cross-legged on the floor, hands resting on metal panels still warm from the day. He would close his eyes and press his fingers into the seams between tiles, and wait. Something always came. A vibration, a cold breath, a whisper so faint it could only be felt in the bones. He didn't understand what it meant, but it felt like remembering. Like something beneath the surface of the world was trying to speak. Not in language, not in light. In hunger. There were no holocrons here. No lessons. No training. And yet, the force around him was not still. It coiled. It drifted. It searched. And when he sat in silence, it listened back. One evening, a caretaker found him staring at the wall. She said his name, or what they had started calling him. The boy turned slowly, blinked once, then said a single word. No, not a refusal, not a cry, just a correction. It wasn't his name, and they never heard his voice again. Weeks later, reports were sent to Coruscant. The child was flagged again, force-sensitive, but emotionally unreadable, unfit for standard training. They didn't call him dangerous, just empty. He was left off the transport list, and in the quiet of the service tunnel beneath the dormitory floor, the boy began to feel something new. Not grief, not anger, hunger, not for food, not for family, but for answers that the Jedi would never give. He was 8 when he first left the dormitory. Not escorted, not supervised, just gone. No one noticed for hours, and when they finally did, there was no trace of panic in the report. No alert sent to the Republic. No missing persons broadcast. Just a quiet line entered into the nightly ledger. Child unaccounted for. Probable wanderer. They found him the next morning, seated at the edge of a canyon bluff 3 kilometers outside the facility. Legs folded, hands resting on his knees, eyes closed, as if he had been waiting for something. He hadn't run away. He had followed something. The cliffs of Ord Talavos were jagged with crystal growths, remnants of old seismic harvesting. They hummed in the morning wind, catching light in angles that shifted as the sun rose. The other children avoided them. Too sharp, too cold. But he was drawn to them. Because the crystals whispered. Not like voices, not like ghosts. They pulsed in patterns, rhythms only he could feel. Each one different, each one incomplete. Like fragments of a song that never played all the way through. He pressed his fingers to the edge of a shard and closed his eyes. And saw fire, the mines, his mother's breath, the red sky, all of it, again, and something more. A figure in the distance, wrapped in black, watching but not helping, just watching. He didn't understand why it returned, why he saw it whenever he closed his eyes. It never moved, never spoke, but it was always there behind the memory, beneath the pain, staring through it all like a shadow etched in stone. And still, it felt familiar. He was sent back with no discipline, no questions. The staff didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't violent, wasn't disobedient, just silent. They gave him more space, more time alone, and the Force followed him. He began to feel it even in sleep, coiling through his ribs, rising behind his eyes, like something alive inside his bones. It wasn't light. And it wasn't peace. It didn't guide him or comfort him. It watched and waited. The Jedi would have called it imbalance, darkness, a wound forming in the Force. But they weren't there. They weren't watching. They had already moved on to other wars, other systems, other children. He was not chosen. He was left behind. And the shadow in his dreams did not offer lessons. It offered memory. Every night it returned, and every night it came closer. He still never saw its face, but the shape was becoming clearer. Not a man, not a Jedi, but something older. A presence shaped by death, covered in ancient robes and the dust of forgotten tombs. And in one dream, it reached out its hand. When he woke, the dormitory lights were flickering. The beds around him were untouched. Not one child stirred. But the floor beneath his cot was cracked, a thin web of fractures spreading from where his fingers had gripped the metal frame. He didn't tell anyone, because he knew no one would understand, and because some part of him didn't want to stop it. He began returning to the cliffs every week, walking the edge in silence, fingers brushing along the crystal lines, listening, remembering, feeling something grow inside him that was not grief. Not anymore. It was hunger, not for food, not for home, but for meaning, for the truth the Jedi would not speak, and for the name of the shadow that had never left him. The last time anyone tried to speak to him was the day the Jedi returned. Not for him, for another. The Outer Rim Center where he lived had become a sorting point, a temporary shelter for Force-sensitive children identified in neutral territories. Knights and Padawans arrived every few cycles now, reviewing candidates too young to understand what they were being tested for. He wasn't one of them. But he watched. From shadows, from vents, from rafters that hadn't been inspected in years. No one noticed the boy crouched between durasteel beams, eyes fixed on the conversation below. They were speaking to a girl, 8 years old, kind eyes, too eager. She smiled when they gave her a training orb, and laughed when it hovered above her hand. The Jedi smiled back. They offered her transport to Coruscant, a future, purpose. The boy didn't move, not even when the master below turned and looked directly toward the ceiling. Their eyes met for only a second. And then the Jedi turned away. He had been seen, and still, left behind. That night, the boy stood alone beneath the stars. Wind blew across the cliffs, carrying the soft static of crystal resonance. He did not sit, did not kneel. He stood like stone, hands outstretched, as if waiting for the galaxy to answer a question it had never asked. Nothing came, not a vision, not a voice, only silence. And yet he didn't stop. He stayed until the stars blurred, until the wind died, until even the crystal song faded, and still he listened. Because deep down, he knew something was there. It wasn't the Jedi. It wasn't the Force. They spoke of the light, the balance, the destiny. What he felt had no destiny. It had no peace. It had only truth. The next day, he vanished. No trace, no theft, no escape alarms. He left behind the rations he'd stored, the shelter he'd built for himself beneath the service duct, the worn synthweave blanket another child had once shared with him. Some said he must have been taken. Others thought he wandered too far and fell. But no body was ever found, and no one looked for long. They never knew where he had gone, but the Force did. It led him to a place no one remembered, a fractured ruin beneath the outer cliffs, half swallowed by landslides, a cavern choked with dead air and black stone. He walked through it without light, drawn by something older than fear. And there, in the dark, he found the voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo. It was a breath, a thought, a shape inside his own mind that was not his. It did not offer comfort. It offered recognition. He did not ask what it was. He already knew. It had no name. It needed none, because it had always been there, in the fire, in the silence, in the moment his mother's arms went still. It had watched him, waited for him, and now, it answered. The force around him shifted, not in brightness, but in weight. He didn't rise into it. He sank into memory, into death, into something colder than the void between stars. He had no training, no master, no path, but he understood now. He didn't need the Jedi. He didn't need saving. He needed the silence, because within it, he could finally hear himself. And though the galaxy did not know his name, the darkness did, and it would remember. They came in robes, not Jedi, not soldiers, just quiet men and women with hollow smiles and no emblems. Their voices were soft, their ship unmarked. They said they were here to help. The caretakers were eager to let the boy go. There were no official transfers, no records, no permission from Coruscant. But when the strangers arrived, no one asked questions. The boy had lived in the cracks too long. No attachments. No words. The staff assumed he was unfit for temple training. One less report to file. One less empty cot to fill. They called themselves healers, refugee caretakers, independent mediators assigned to help transition trauma cases. The Republic had no registry of them. The Jedi had no knowledge, but they knew who he was. And he followed them without resistance. The ship was cold. No beds, no lights, only steel corridors and sealed doors. They did not feed him. They did not speak to him. But they watched, eyes never blinking, footsteps never echoing. By the time they arrived, he already knew. These were not protectors. They were predators. The place had no name. A fractured outpost buried beneath the crust of a forgotten world, a former mining relay turned hollow temple. It reeked of iron and age. The walls were not decorated with flags or stars, but with scratches. Deep grooves carved by hands no longer alive to explain them. He wasn't the only child. Dozens of others moved through the halls, some older, some younger. None spoke, none smiled. Their eyes moved, but their minds did not. As if something had hollowed them out, then left the shell standing. They called it obedience. He was assigned to a chamber, no bed, just stone and straw and silence. They gave him clothes, grey wrappings, marked by dust and ash. And they gave him rules: wake before light, speak only when spoken to, move only when told. Failure meant punishment. Obedience meant less pain. They never explained what they wanted from him, only that he would learn. They beat the first lesson into him within hours. He had looked too long at a masked figure passing through the corridor. No words, no defiance, just a glance. And for that, they dragged him into the center of the training floor and left him for the others to strike. He did not cry. He did not fight back. They called it progress. But they were wrong. He wasn't surrendering. He was watching. And beneath the bruises and silence, he was learning. The place was a cult, a forgotten splinter from an older Sith order, buried and broken after the war. They no longer followed the rule of two. They followed nothing but fear. Their leaders wore masks not to hide, but to erase. There were no names here, no identities, only roles. Children became servants. Servants became tools, and tools were thrown away when they broke. But Glovoc didn't break. He adapted. Each punishment taught him rhythm. Each scream taught him tone. He studied every motion, every breath, every weakness. He learned where the guards looked, when they didn't, how long it took for pain to fade, which words triggered cruelty, which silences earned survival. They wanted to strip him of self, but in trying to destroy him, they revealed the truth. Power was not in dominance, it was in patience. They mistook his silence for obedience. But the shadow within him was listening, waiting, and it would speak soon. There were no names in the compound, only labels. Each child was marked with a number, burned into a thin strip of cloth stitched into their collar. His was 19K. They never said it aloud. They just showed it to him when punishment was due, when orders were issued, when pain was given instead of food. He stopped recognizing it as his within days. The others didn't speak their labels either. They only moved when commanded, following drills in silence, eating in silence, sleeping in silence. The air itself was still. The only sound was the hum of the generators and the quiet crackle of voltage behind the punishment doors. They were called tests, but they weren't testing strength. They were measuring surrender. The children were forced to carry weighted blocks from chamber to chamber, crawling through mud-thick tunnels and heat-press corridors. They stood for hours without rest, stared into floodlights until their eyes burned, held planks above their heads while being watched through mirrored glass. If they failed, they were taken. No one returned from those rooms, except one, a boy, older, stronger. His collar read 07D. He came back broken not from the body, but from the eyes. Something had been carved out of him. Not flesh, not muscle, but memory. He no longer responded to commands, no longer flinched at beatings. He just stood in the corner of the dormitory and stared at nothing. They left him there, because he was no longer useful. Glovoc watched all of it, not with fear, but with clarity. He saw what the others did not, that these people weren't Sith. Not truly. They wore the trappings. They quoted fragments of the code. They whispered of passion, and strength and chains. But they were parasites, worshippers of a power they didn't understand. They thought pain was power. That fear was strength. But Glovoc felt something deeper. When he lay still in the sleeping hall at night, he would close his eyes and press his palm to the stone floor. Beneath the cold, beneath the quiet, he could feel it. A pulse, a current. Something ancient buried in the foundations. The Force. But not as the Jedi taught it. not as the Sith claimed it. This version was quieter, more patient. It did not demand violence, it waited, it learned. Like him, one night, he was summoned, not by voice but by a silent signal, projected through the lighting system. A flicker of red, once, then darkness. The others didn't react. They had seen it before, and none had returned. He walked alone through the corridor, feet bare, hands empty. The door opened without a sound. Inside was only shadow, and something breathing. Not a person, not a creature, a presence. It sat cloaked in black, face hidden beneath a durasteel mask shaped like a cracked skull. It said nothing, but the force swirled around it like smoke, bending the air, thinning the light. This was no instructor. It was a remnant. A Sith from a time before titles, before rules. Its skin was broken. Its voice, unused for years, barely moved the air. But when it looked at him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Recognition. The figure didn't ask questions. It didn't speak his name. It simply raised a hand, and with a gesture, lifted him from the floor without touch. No anger, no pain, just control. Pure, precise, effortless control. And in that moment, Glovoc understood what the cult had never shown him. The force was not a whip, it was a wire. And power came not from rage, but from restraint. He returned from the chamber in silence. No injuries, no bruises, no marks on his collar. The other children stared when he entered the sleeping hall. No one spoke, no one asked where he had gone. But their eyes followed him now, not out of fear, not out of awe, but confusion. He was not like them anymore. Something had shifted. In the days that followed, he was no longer assigned to drills. No more stone lifting. No more crawling through sludge. No more punishment blocks. He was left alone in the mornings, given no instructions, no tasks. The cultists had not forgotten him. They had excluded him, but he was still being watched. In the far corner of the mess hall, behind a shielded viewport, the masked figure remained, silent, motionless, always present. It never spoke, never moved. But Glovoc could feel its gaze in his chest. Not like a threat, like a question. They gave him new tasks. Not physical ones, but precise ones. Pattern memorization. Language drills in ancient Sith dialects. Object balancing through the Force. Silent movement through the lower tunnels. One task after another. Some meant nothing. Others nearly killed him. But he passed them all, not with power, but with control. He never used anger, never called on emotion. He drew instead from silence, from the memory of breath in the dark, from the weight of his mother's arms, from the sound of his own heart slowing when the air had thinned. It wasn't light, and it wasn't the dark side as the cult used it. It was something else. The instructors noticed. He could hear them speaking through the walls, not about his potential, but their unease. He wasn't following the path they wanted. He didn't lash out, didn't beg, didn't break. He obeyed, but only on the surface. And that made him dangerous. One day, they tested him again. Not with pain, with mercy. They brought him to the punishment room. A girl was tied to the post, young, maybe 6, bruised, shaking. She had failed an obedience test. Her task was simple: endure. His task was simpler: deliver. They handed him a stun rod. Cold, smooth, humming. They gave no instruction, only looked at him. He walked to her slowly. She didn't beg. She didn't look away. Her eyes searched his like she still believed someone could be kind here. Even now, he raised the rod. paused, and in that breathless moment, something inside him fractured not out of pity, but realization. This was not strength. This was theater. They weren't testing his loyalty. They were trying to provoke weakness. So he turned and struck the instructor in the throat. 3 more came at him. 2 fell to forceful pushes. The third caught him in the ribs with a shock prod. He collapsed. The rod was pulled from his hand. But he smiled, not because he'd won, but because he'd revealed their fear. That night, they locked him in the cold cell, the one they used for those who broke too far. The walls hummed with static fields. The air was thin. The lights dimmed every few minutes, then snapped back on. They thought isolation would break him. But he thrived in silence. For 7 days, he said nothing, did nothing, just breathed. And in that stillness, he felt the force settle around him like fog, neither dark nor light, just present, listening, like it too was waiting. And on the 8th day, the door opened. The masked figure stood in the threshold. No guards, no threats, only a single gesture. Come, he followed without hesitation. The corridor was colder than before, lit only by low amber strips along the floor. Dust floated in the air like drifting ash, disturbed by each step. The facility was silent, too silent. No drills, no orders, no movement from the other children. As if the compound itself was holding its breath. The masked figure walked ahead of him, robes dragging across the metal tiles. No sound, no weight. Like a shadow wearing the memory of a body. When it reached the chamber, it stopped. The door slid open with a long, slow breath, revealing a room he had not seen before. No chains, no tools, no symbols, just a circle carved into the stone. Old markings lined the edges, ancient Sith script worn down by time, cracked by heat, and stained by the lives of those who had stood inside before him. The boy stepped into the center. The door sealed behind them. He waited. The figure raised one hand, palm open. The air vibrated, dust shifted. The circle around him glowed faint red, not bright, not violent, more like dying embers remembering warmth. He felt the force gather, not around him, but beneath him, pulled from the stone, from the foundation, from something buried far deeper than the cult understood. For the first time, the masked figure spoke. Not loudly, not clearly. Its voice sounded like broken wires scraping through a throat long forgotten by life. What do you fear? The boy didn't answer. The figure repeated the question, the air trembling with each syllable. What do you fear? He closed his eyes. He did not see the cult, not the punishments, not the drills. He saw the mining shaft, the fire, the breath of his mother fading, the world going silent around him. He whispered, nothing. The chamber responded. The circle flared. The air snapped. The force surged upward, pulling at him, testing him. Not physically, not painfully, emotionally. It reached into his memories and dragged them forward, not to break him, but to measure him. He saw himself as a child, weak, alone, forgotten. And then he saw what the masked figure wanted him to see. A blade, a hand, a choice. If he reached for anger, the power would come easily. If he reached for pain, it would flood him. But he did neither. He breathed, slow, quiet, still. He allowed the force to move, then allowed it to settle. The masked figure lowered its hand. You do not fear loss. No reaction. You do not fear pain. No reaction. You do not fear death. Still nothing. The figure stepped closer. The force thickened around its presence. You fear only truth. His eyes opened, and for the first time he spoke in a steady voice. "I fear being nothing." The figure nodded, not with kindness, with satisfaction. It removed its mask. The face beneath was pale, scarred, half-burned, barely living, eyes sunken, breath shallow. A Sith who had survived far beyond natural years, sustained not by life, but by will. It knelt, lowering itself to the circle's edge. "Then learn." A whisper, a command, a promise. The air shifted again, but this time it did not strike. It wrapped around him, coiling through his arms, his chest, his mind, not crushing, not burning, shaping. Like molten metal poured into a mold. He felt the force answering him for the first time. Not through rage, not through fear, through silence. The figure rose. "You speak without words," it murmured. "You listen without sound. You survive without mercy. You will become more than they ever were." The door opened behind him. Light flooded the chamber. Not daylight, firelight. The compound was burning. Screams echoed through the corridors. Cultists ran in panic, shadows twisting against the walls. Someone had attacked, someone powerful, someone relentless. The boy smelled smoke, blood, fear. The masked figure looked down at him one last time. "Go." And the child, who would become Darth Glovoc, stepped into the fire without flinching. The Jedi did not arrive with a strike team. There were no gunships, no banners, no orders shouted through comms. Just a single vessel, small, civilian-marked, half-worn from travel. It touched down in the outer marsh of the compound in silence, its hull steaming in the cool rain. At first, the cult thought it was nothing. A lost trader, a scavenger. But the sensors caught a signature. Something ancient, controlled, familiar in its clarity. A Jedi. One of them muttered a warning. Another reached for the alarm. But the master never gave the order. He didn't fear what was coming, because they believed the boy would protect them. They were wrong. He watched from the stone alcove high above the courtyard. The rain had already soaked through his clothes, pooling in his collar, dripping down his spine. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He only watched. The figure moved through the lower causeway with purpose, not rushed, not hesitant. A man of middle years, wrapped in a gray-brown cloak, hood down. His beard was trimmed, his face worn, but there was something about his presence that disturbed even the silence. He wasn't searching. He already knew where to go. The alarms activated 5 minutes too late. By the time the outer defense sentries fired, the Jedi was already within the perimeter. He didn't block their shots. He didn't leap. He simply waved one hand. And the turrets died. The cult's guards poured into the courtyard, 6 in total, trained in combat, armed with vibroblades and shock spears. He didn't draw his saber. Not at first. He waited. When the first guard lunged, the blade ignited. Blue. It hummed through the rain like a memory returning home. 1 stroke, 2 steps, 3 men down. The 4th hesitated. The 5th fell backward. The 6th ran. The Jedi said nothing. The boy followed him. Not out of loyalty. Not out of fear. But because for the first time in years, someone had entered this place who didn't reek of weakness. He moved through the halls like a shadow, neutralizing patrols without killing them. He stunned where he could, disarmed where he must. He made his way toward the command chamber, the center of the compound, where the master waited, where the boy had first heard the Force whisper his name. And yet, something pulled him off course, through a side corridor, toward a sealed meditation vault. The boy knew that room. It was where the cult hid the holocrons they didn't understand, remnants from Sith they refused to name. The air in that wing was always colder, always heavier. The Jedi placed his hand against the door and paused, not in confusion, not in fear, in recognition. The boy stepped forward, quietly, no weapon, no threat. The Jedi turned, their eyes met, and the room seemed to stop breathing. The man didn't raise his blade. He didn't call for peace. He simply studied the child in front of him, drenched in rain, eyes hollow, presence cold. He opened his mouth, as if to say something, and the boy struck. Not with a weapon, with the Force. No warning, no wind-up, just a raw, explosive blast, not elegant, not shaped, pure will. The corridor buckled, stone cracked. The door behind the Jedi bent inward. But he held his ground, not because of strength, because of sorrow. The blade hummed again. Blue light cut the storm in half, and Glovoc understood. This man didn't come to kill. He came to save, which meant he didn't know how this would end. The clash came without warning. Stone split beneath their feet as the boy moved, not with skill, but with instinct. He'd never been trained in form or kata. He didn't know Shicho or Sorisu, but he knew how to survive, how to strike, how to make pain mean something. The Force surged around him like water cracking through a dam, wild, uncontrolled, answering his rage, not his command. The Jedi held steady. His blade moved in arcs, not attacks. He deflected, guided, redirected. He didn't press forward. He didn't strike to kill. Even when Glovoc's wave shattered the ceiling beams and sent a blast of stone into the man's ribs, the saber did not retaliate. Because the Jedi wasn't here for a duel. He was here for a child, but Glovoc had already left that behind. He closed the distance, sliding beneath the Jedi's defense with a sweep of the hand that sent dust into the man's eyes. It didn't stop him, but it staggered him. Enough for Glovoc to slam a fist into his knee, then another into his throat. The Jedi fell to one knee, not defeated, just tired. Rain poured in through the fractured ceiling, washing blood into cracks along the floor. The boy stood over him, hands trembling, breath uneven. The Force still screamed around him, raw and untrained. Lightning without direction, and yet, the man didn't raise his blade. He looked up and spoke softly. "You don't have to be this." 6 words, not a warning, not a lesson, a plea. For a moment, the silence returned, that kind of silence only found after a scream. Glovoc blinked, confused. The voice was calm, gentle, familiar in a way that hurt. Like a memory of someone he could no longer remember. But the quiet didn't last. From the far end of the hall came the sound of boots. Cult guards, not the weak ones, the true enforcers. 2 of them carried shock pikes. The third, a cortosis-forged blade. All of them angry. All of them afraid. They didn't speak, they just charged. And in that moment, something in Glovoc snapped. He turned, lifted his hand, and without thinking crushed the first guard's ribcage with a flick of the Force. The second flew into the ceiling and didn't come down whole. The third struck with the cortosis blade, and Glovoc caught it barehanded. The pain didn't register. He twisted the metal from the guard's grip and drove it through the man's chest. Then silence again. The boy turned back to the Jedi, his eyes now filled with something the man hadn't seen before. Clarity. This wasn't a child. Not anymore. The Jedi stood slowly, rain trailing down his face. His saber deactivated, his hands open, his voice steady. "You're not lost." But Glovoc only shook his head. "I was never found." The words came out low, dry, like dust from a forgotten tomb. The Jedi stepped forward once, and Glovoc moved faster. A wave of the hand. The Jedi's saber flew from his belt, not into Glovoc's grasp, but across the hall, into the shattered stone. The next blow was physical. Elbow to the side of the neck, knee to the thigh. A final push that sent the man crashing into the wall with enough force to knock him unconscious. Not dead, not bleeding, but gone, and the boy stood alone. Rain still falling, saber still humming in the distance, hands still shaking. Not because of fear, but because something inside him had changed. The Force had always followed him, but now it obeyed. He didn't know how long the Jedi lay unconscious. Minutes, maybe hours. Time inside the compound no longer followed the rules of the outside world. Rain slowed it, silence stretched it, and the Force wrapped around it like a fog that swallowed everything except intention. Glovoc stood in the broken corridor, breathing in the weight of what he had done, not with pride, not with guilt. Just understanding. A shift had happened not in his body, not in his thoughts, but in the Force itself. It didn't whisper anymore. It watched. He knelt beside the Jedi, studying the man's face. There was no hatred there, no fear, only concern, etched into worn lines, shaped by years of trying to save worlds that didn't want saving. Glovoc had never seen someone fight so hard without killing. It confused him. The cultists never fought without blood. They used blades, cruelty, obedience. They took power by taking breath. The Jedi didn't. He deflected. He endured. He guided. Even in danger, he chose restraint. And restraint was something Glovoc had never been given. The rain dripped through the cracked ceiling, landing on the man's cheek like quiet tears. Glovoc reached out, brushing the water aside. Not gently, not softly, just to see what it felt like. The Jedi stirred. Glovoc stepped back. The man's eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light. He saw the boy, saw the bodies, saw the destroyed hallway. And still, he said nothing harsh. No anger, no blame. Just a breath. "You're stronger than they understood," he said. Glovoc didn't answer. The Jedi pushed himself upright, gripping the wall for support. His saber lay across the corridor, but he didn't reach for it. He looked at the boy the way a man studies a storm, with caution, with awe, with sorrow for what it might become. "Come with me," he said quietly. "You don't belong here." The boy blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "No?" he asked. "Not with them," the Jedi replied. "Not with their pain. Not with what they forced you to learn." Glovoc tilted his head. "You think I want peace?" The man hesitated. "I think you want truth." The statement struck him harder than any blade. He felt something shift, not in him, but around him. Rain thickened. The air cooled. The world grew still, waiting. Truth. He remembered the masked instructor. The first time the Force lifted him without anger. The moment he realized power didn't need violence. It needed purpose. The cult never understood that. They believed darkness was an emotion, a hunger, a wound. But the Force had shown him something different. And now this Jedi spoke the same word, truth. Glovoc stepped closer. The man didn't back away. "You came alone," the boy said. "I had no choice," the Jedi replied. "The Order didn't believe what I found here. They didn't see the signs. But I felt something. Someone calling out." "I didn't call you," Glovoc said. The Jedi nodded. "I know, but the Force did." Silence followed. Heavy, sharp, a blade waiting to fall. The boy stared into the man's eyes, trying to find weakness, fear, pity. There was none. Only patience, only hope. Hope. The word tasted wrong. He turned away. The Jedi stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. "You don't have to carry their darkness," he whispered. "You can walk a different path." Glovoc didn't look back. "I already chose my path," he said. "And what is it?" the Jedi asked. The boy closed his eyes. "The one where no one owns me." Before the man could respond, the ground trembled. A distant explosion echoed through the halls. The cultists had begun their counterattack. Fires spread. Screams rose. Power surged through the compound like a wounded beast. The Jedi reached for his saber at last. But the Force had already chosen. And it did not choose him. It chose the boy standing in the rain-soaked corridor, the child who had learned silence as a language and pain as a teacher. Glovoc opened his eyes, and the storm inside him awakened. The fire spread fast. Not because of the fuel, not because of the structure, but because fear had already hollowed the compound from the inside. The cultists had spent years building obedience, brick by brick, through punishment and repetition. But obedience couldn't stop fire, and it couldn't stop a child the Force had finally stopped ignoring. Glovoc moved through the smoke like a ghost. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked, eyes calm, limbs steady. The storm behind his eyes had gone still. Not because it had ended, because it had found direction. The guards who tried to stop him never had a chance. Their weapons flew from their hands before they could strike. Some collapsed without being touched. Others turned and fled before they even saw him. It wasn't rage that moved him. It was control. A deep, perfect stillness inside the storm. The Jedi followed. He didn't try to stop the boy. He knew he couldn't. Not anymore. He walked a step behind, clearing fire where he could, shielding children who stumbled into the chaos. He didn't try to take control, because the Force had already given it away. They reached the center of the compound, the command chamber, where the cult's inner circle once gave orders. The place where masks were assigned, where pain was passed down like a legacy. Now it was nearly empty. Half the room had collapsed, stone pillars cracked, sparks flew from shattered consoles. Only one figure remained. The instructor Glovoc had once feared. The one who had dragged him into punishment drills, who called him 19K, who never raised his voice but made children vanish. He stood at the far end of the room, robes singed, face pale beneath his cracked mask. He raised a blade. "Stop." One word. Not shouted, not screamed, just offered. Glovoc didn't slow. "You belong to us," the man said. "You were shaped by us, forged by our will." "No," Glovoc answered quietly. "You tried to erase me, and I survived anyway." The instructor stepped forward. "You have power, but no direction. You need us. Without us," the boy raised his hand, and the man dropped to his knees. Not crushed, not broken, just held there by invisible pressure, by the weight of everything he had once inflicted now pressing back against him. Glovoc looked into his eyes. "You gave me no name, no past, no future, only silence." He stepped closer. "And now that silence is yours." With one movement, the Force surged through him, not with anger, but with finality. The man slumped to the ground, unconscious, not dead, but erased, in the way only power can erase completely, utterly, without noise. The Jedi stood in the doorway. He hadn't moved. He hadn't interfered. He simply watched. Glovoc turned toward him. No pride in his eyes. No joy. Only understanding. The man stepped forward, slowly. "You could come with me," he said. "Learn to control this. Shape it. Use it to help others." Glovoc shook his head. "I already learned control. You just didn't like what I used it for." The rain had begun to fall again. Light drops filtered through the fractured ceiling, tapping against the stone like the echo of something old, something forgotten. The Jedi nodded once, and said nothing more. He turned and walked away, back through the burning halls, back through the screams and smoke, until he was gone. Glovoc remained. He looked at the ruined room, at the broken blade still clutched in the instructor's hand, at the ashes floating through the air like snow. And for the first time in his life, he breathed without fear. Not because he was safe, but because he was alone. And in that aloneness, he was free. He didn't return to the surface for a long time. After the fire, after the screams, after the Jedi had gone and the cult had collapsed into ash, Glovoc descended deeper, not upward toward rescue, but downward toward something older. Beneath the compound's foundation, hidden behind collapsed tunnels and buried vents, was something the others never dared explore. A vault. Not a temple, not a shrine. A place built before the cult, before the instructors, before him. Its walls were scarred by heat and age, its symbols eroded by time. Sith markings, but not in basic, not even in high Sith. These were older. Proto-runes, barely translated even in the archives of Korriban. The holocrons were waiting. He didn't find them all at once. Some were broken, others were buried beneath collapsed stone. But he felt them, like hearts still beating under layers of dust. He pulled them out with quiet care, never forcing, never rushing. Each one taught him something, not through patience, not through guidance, through pain. Some refused to open. Others attacked his mind the moment they activated. One nearly killed him, flooding his nervous system with raw memory until he collapsed in a seizure that lasted half a day. But he returned the next evening, because he understood what they were. These weren't tools, they were trials. The Sith who recorded them didn't want students. They wanted survivors. He learned quickly, not just history but perspective, that the Sith had not always been ruled by the rule of two. That before Bane, before Revan, before the exiled Jedi had shaped the dark teachings into something cruel and precise, there were other paths, paths of chaos, of freedom, of solitary ascension. He read the words of Sorza's Sin, of Zozan, of Tulak Horde. He listened to forgotten ghosts whisper from pyramids made of pain and crystal. And as he did, one thing became clear. They had never wanted masters. They had wanted power, but not the kind that ruled, the kind that endured. He studied the rituals in silence, the blood scripts, the illusions, the bindings. He practiced them in the lower tunnels, far from light, far from judgment. He didn't test them on others. Not yet. He tested them on himself. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating for days at a time. He trained his body to respond not to comfort, but to focus. Each breath measured, each movement precise, each meditation a descent into deeper thought, not of peace, but of clarity. The cult had tried to break his will. The Jedi had tried to turn it. But neither had given him what he now found. Choice. No one told him how to learn. No one told him what to feel. He chose. And in that choice, he became something else. Not a Sith in title. Not a Jedi in exile. Just a shadow. One that fed on knowledge instead of fear. That grew not through conquest, but through understanding. There were others, of course. Whispers of Sith warlords rising in the Outer Rim. False Darths taking mantles they hadn't earned. secret cabals buried in asteroid temples or ancient catacombs. Some tried to contact him. One even found him. He sent back only their ship. Empty. He had no interest in masters, no desire to kneel. The galaxy had taught him one lesson too clearly. Those who bow are the first to fall, and he would never bow again. Some holocrons did not open through willpower. They required something more. Not force sensitivity, not command of the dark side, but sacrifice. A piece of the self, given freely, not in body but in memory. He didn't understand that at first. The holocron was shaped like a blade's hilt, twisted and charred, with veins of obsidian running down its center. When he touched it, it didn't spark or resist. It simply held his hand in place, not physically, but through sensation. A cold pulse ran through his fingertips. His breath slowed, his vision narrowed. He saw himself standing in the tunnel, and then saw nothing. Not darkness, not sleep, absence. When he woke, 6 hours had passed, and he had forgotten the name of his mother. He remembered her shape, her breath, her sacrifice, but the sound of her name, the one thing that had stayed with him through fire, hunger, silence, was gone. Taken. He screamed, but not aloud. The holocron had accepted his offering, and it opened. Inside was no voice, no illusion, just a singular truth, one he had never read before. A ritual, once used by ancient Sith Lords to sever their ties to the Force without dying. A technique not to hide, but to disappear. Not a cloak, not a mask, an erasure. He didn't understand why anyone would want it, until later. When he opened the next one, it was older, cracked, marked with blood symbols not drawn by hand but carved into living skin. It responded to pain, not presence. He sliced across his palm and let the blood fall. The holocron trembled, and then it screamed. Not into the air, into his mind. The scream wasn't words, it was emotion, memory. 1,000 years of agony compressed into a single moment of contact. He collapsed, not because of pain, because of clarity. The Sith Lord who created it had believed pain was language, that the Force responded not to will but to suffering, that each trauma was a syllable and power came from learning to read what others ran from. Glovoc wept after that one, not because he was hurt, because he knew it was true. Each memory taken from him, each night he had spent in silence, every time someone had tried to erase him, it had shaped him, taught him, and the Force had not punished him for it. It had rewarded him. He didn't stop opening the holocrons. Even when they cost him more than he could name, he began losing small things. Sounds, faces, the smell of the mines, the laugh of a child he once shared a blanket with in the dormitory, the face of the Jedi who tried to save him. Gone. He wrote nothing down, because he didn't need to remember. The Force remembered for him. It reshaped his mind, carving old memories into space for new truths, ancient codes, forgotten dialects, maps to planets that no longer appeared on Republic star charts. Some of them were ruins. Some of them still breathed. He began to send pieces of himself across the galaxy, not clones, not droids, just echoes. Through stolen Sith rituals, he learned how to place fragments of his consciousness into hidden objects. A blade, a mask, a cracked meditation stone. He wanted to know what the Sith had forgotten. He wanted to feel what they had buried. But most of all, he wanted to prove he could walk through their darkness without becoming them. Not every holocron should be opened. He knew that. But he opened them anyway, because somewhere deep within the chaos, he was searching for one voice. the only one that had ever spoken to him without wanting to control him. And he knew it was still out there, waiting. Power did not surprise him anymore. Not the kind that broke stone, not the kind that silenced breath. Those forms of strength were simple. They belonged to brutes, to warlords, to Sith who mistook destruction for destiny. What unsettled him was something quieter, the realization that the Force itself had begun to move differently around him. Not resisting, not guiding, yielding, as if it had stopped treating him like a student and started treating him like a threat. He noticed it first when he reached the ruins of an old outpost built during the Great Sith War. It lay on a forgotten moon once scarred by the armies of Exar Kun. The stone slabs were still marked with his followers' symbols. Singing winds passed through the broken archways. The locals believed the place cursed, so they stayed away. Glovoc walked through its halls, as if he had lived there once. The Force felt strange heavy behind him, light before him, like a river parting around a stone. Wildlife moved aside without understanding why. The temperature dropped when he exhaled. Each step carried an echo that didn't match his weight. It was as if the world refused to stand in his way. He found another holocron there, small, shattered, barely alive with energy. When he touched it, the recording flickered an image of a Sith Lord he recognized only from fragmented texts. Darth Vecros, a master who rejected apprentices, claiming all who knelt were unworthy. She believed the dark side responded only to those who walked alone. Her voice was faint. Power kneels to no one, and those who demand kneeling are weak. He listened to the message again and again until the holocron died in his hands. Those words followed him. He traveled from ruin to ruin, from moon to moon, searching for more truths hidden in dust and forgotten tombs. He found old Sith armor fused to rock by ancient lightning, found ritual chambers where walls still bled memories, found caves where the Force felt like a presence crouched in the dark watching him pass. Each place offered him something different, but none offered him a master. He refused them all. A group of exiled acolytes found him next, survivors of a broken sect scattered after a failed uprising against a self-proclaimed Darth in the Outer Rim. They tracked him for days, watching from the shadows. When they approached, they knelt immediately. "Teach us," their leader said. "We felt your presence. We felt its weight." Glovoc said nothing. "We will serve." He walked past them. They followed him for 2 days, begging for instruction. When they grew desperate, one attempted to strike him not out of hatred, but out of frustration, hoping to provoke a lesson. He never touched them. The Force did. A whisper of motion, a shift in air, and they collapsed to the ground, not dead, not injured, but unable to rise, as if gravity had deepened only for them. Glovoc looked back once. "I do not teach," he said. "I do not lead. Power bows to no one, and neither do I." The acolytes didn't pursue him again. Word spread. In the underworld markets of Iridonia, in the smuggler dens of Nal Hutta, in the ruins of Korriban's lower tombs, a wanderer, a shadow, a Force wielder with no title, no allies, no loyalties. Some believed he was a Sith Lord rising before his time. Others believed he was a Jedi experiment gone wrong. A few thought he was a myth. He wasn't any of those things. He was simply untamed. Power sought followers. Power wanted obedience. Power wanted to be seen. But he wanted none of that. He wanted understanding. He wanted silence. He wanted the freedom that came only from refusing every chain the galaxy tried to place on him. And the Force itself seemed to step aside as he carved his own path, a path no master controlled. A path only he could walk. There were no stars where he ended up, not because they had burned out, because he had chosen to go where they could not follow. A fragment world, drifting at the edge of a failed system, broken apart by centuries of gravitational decay. Its surface was jagged, its sky pale with dust. There were no settlements, no signs of life, just wind, rock, and silence. He found the cave on the third day. Or maybe it found him. It wasn't large, no temple markings, no statues, just an opening barely wide enough for a man to pass through. But the force swirled inside it like smoke trapped in glass. Not dark, not light, just dense, timeless. He stepped inside without hesitation. It wasn't a place of power, it was a place of memory. The walls pulsed with echoes, not voices, not visions, but emotions. Layers of grief and fury and sorrow stretched thin across the stone. Like hundreds had come here before. Not to speak, not to fight, to let go. He didn't meditate. He didn't kneel. He stood in the center of the cavern, closed his eyes, and breathed. And for the first time in years, the Force spoke first. It showed him the Jedi, not the man's face, but the moment. The hesitation in the corridor, the hand extended in peace, the refusal to strike even when struck. It showed him the cult, not their punishments, but their fear, the way they clung to control because they had none of their own, their rituals, their masks, their obedience. It showed him himself, not his victories, but the cracks, the name he could no longer remember, the voice he still waited to hear. The child buried beneath everything he had become. He didn't look away, didn't resist. He let the truth pass through him like a wave, cold, sharp, cleansing. And when it was over, he opened his eyes. The cavern was still. The wind outside had stopped. Even the air felt different, lighter. He had not been tested. He had been seen. Not as a Sith, not as a threat, not even as a Force wielder, but as a wound, one the galaxy didn't know how to heal, and that meant it never would. He didn't weep, didn't smile. He simply sat, not to rest, but to wait, to listen. He remained in that cave for days, then weeks. No holocrons, no blades, no visitors. And slowly, the Force began to change. Not around him, within him. It no longer moved in bursts, no longer surged in storms. It flowed, constant, balanced, not tamed but respected, not conquered but understood. He wasn't looking for immortality. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for the shape of something lost the way the galaxy had been before the Jedi claimed to own peace and the Sith claimed to own power. And in his silence, he found clarity. He didn't need a master. He didn't need a title. He didn't need the rule of two, or the council, or the past. He needed space, to grow, to wait, to become something the Force wasn't ready for, but would eventually be forced to reckon with. When he left the cave, no one saw him. No one tracked him. No one knew his name. He didn't leave a symbol, didn't leave a scar. He left only one thing behind, etched faintly into the cave wall with a broken stone, as if carved by instinct, not intention. A circle, incomplete, and beside it, a single line of Sith text. Power belongs to the one who stands alone. The Republic called it a border instability, a chain of minor systems in the mid-rim, caught between old trade disputes and new expansion routes. No major fleets stationed there. No colonies worth defending. Just drifting ore stations, fuel depots, and moons too poor to matter. To the Senate, it was a logistical problem. To the Jedi, it was quiet. To Glovoc, it was a doorway. He had no interest in planets. He didn't want to conquer, didn't want to rule. He wanted to test something older than any treaty. A Sith ritual found in a shattered holocron, too damaged to fully translate, too dangerous to ignore. It wasn't a weapon, it was a signal. One that could move through hyperspace the same way a tremor moves through water. Not through sound, through fear. He needed three things: proximity, alignment, and silence. The moons of Bellara, Kelros, and Vault 3 linked orbits across separate systems gave him the perfect geometry. Each one, once touched by war, now forgotten by peace. He moved between them alone, leaving no trace, no broadcasts, no blood, only presence. He didn't build temples. He carved circles, shallow, precise. Not in stone, but in memory. He used old tunnels where miners had died in cave-ins, crashed med-centers where plague victims had once been locked inside, empty observation towers where officers had transmitted surrender signals no one ever answered, places where the Force had learned to echo sorrow. He left no holocrons behind, only moments. He stood in each place for less than a day, closed his eyes, slowed his breath, pushed the Force outward, not as command but as pressure. A slow, cold tide that stretched itself into the spaces between shields and airlocks, into the shadows behind navigation panels and communication relays. He didn't need control, he needed doubt, and the ritual gave him exactly that. Within 2 weeks, the mining guilds of the Kelros moon began reporting mass resignations. Workers wouldn't return to the surface, not because of injury, because of feeling. They said something was watching them underground. On Bellara, a Republic scout vessel went missing. It never sent a distress call. Its logs showed no anomaly. The ship simply drifted off course, then shut down. When recovery crews arrived, they found the crew intact, alive, but unwilling to speak. One officer had carved words into the command chair. Something knew we were coming. By the time Vault's fuel stations started broadcasting incomplete messages, bursts of static, long silences, unfinished sentences, panic began to spread. Not to the Senate, but to the locals, to the supply fleets, to the civilian guilds who depended on these systems for raw materials and safe passage. They didn't know who Glovoc was. They only knew that something had changed. The Force itself had changed, and no one could explain how. No bombs, no invasions, no assassinations, just silence. And in that silence, paranoia spread faster than fire. The Jedi eventually responded not with knights, but with envoys. They sent mediators, healers, diplomats, those who specialized in grief. It didn't work, because no one had died. At least, not yet. And Glovoc watched it all unfold from a place far outside their reach. Not through surveillance, through sensation. He could feel the shift, the tremble of systems turning inward, the first signs of fracture, not because they were attacked, but because they believed they were about to be. Fear was a disease, and he had infected the air itself. Without lifting a blade, without speaking a word, he hadn't started the war, but he had made them believe it had already begun. The ritual wasn't designed for battle. It had no explosion, no blood offering, no chant to summon fire from the stars. It was meant to collapse belief. He found it etched into the fractured remains of a holocron buried beneath a ruined observatory on a dead world once marked by the Infinite Empire. The glyphs had no direct translation. Half of them weren't even Sith. They belonged to something older, possibly Rakatan, or something the Rakata feared. But the meaning was clear. It was a ritual of infection. Not biological, not chemical. spiritual. It targeted what the Jedi never considered vulnerable: certainty. The texts warned that to use it would come at a cost. Not a life, a presence. The one who performed it would begin to lose connection to the Force as it was known, not severed, but changed, filtered, bent into something colder. Glovoc accepted that without hesitation. He had never wanted the Force's favor, only its silence. The ritual began with anchoring. Each site had to be marked not with blood, but with fear, not created, remembered. A moment when fear had triumphed, when those who lived had felt forgotten, when the Force had stepped aside and let suffering take root. Kelros had the tunnel collapse. Valt had the plague station. Bellara had the broadcast that never reached anyone. He sat in each location and relived the memory, not his, but the place's. Through the Force, he allowed himself to feel every cry, every breathless pause, every hopeless stare. He didn't purge those moments. He kept them, and let them reshape him. When the anchoring was complete, the spread began. He didn't send the Force outward with will. He let it leak, subtle, directionless. It crept into navigation errors, into sleep cycles, into fragmented dreams. Pilots reported headaches. Technicians began forgetting procedures. Nothing major, nothing measurable, just cracks. The kind no one fixed, until everything broke. He stayed far away, monitoring from an old observation platform orbiting a long-abandoned asteroid base. The platform had no weapons, no shields, just deep-range sensors and enough power to run its systems for 20 more years. Perfect. He watched the systems begin to bleed. First came delays, then shortages, then accusations. Local trade guilds turned on each other. Shipping lanes grew quiet. Jedi envoys left without results. Republic mid-command began preparing reassignment orders for troops that hadn't yet been deployed. It was working, but not because of what he'd done, because of what they didn't do. No one questioned the fear. They only listened to it. The Jedi still hadn't realized the pattern. They thought it was psychological, a regional phenomenon. They studied the populations, searched for chemical exposure, considered disease, but they never thought to look at the Force itself. They assumed it would warn them. It hadn't, because Glovoc hadn't attacked it. He had stepped around it, and whispered into the places the Jedi couldn't reach. The cost was beginning to show. His vision darkened at the edges now. Lights felt farther away. Sound arrived slower than before. It was as if his senses were being dulled from the outside in. But his mind had never been clearer, because the Force was no longer clouded by emotion or history. It was still, and in that stillness, he could feel systems beginning to collapse, not from force, but from doubt. He hadn't destroyed anything. He had simply reminded them of what they truly were. Afraid. Fear doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it just moves things slightly out of place. A light that flickers for no reason. A door that doesn't close the way it used to. A schedule that drifts by seconds, then minutes, until everything feels wrong but no one knows why. That was what happened to the Bellara stations first. Traffic controllers stopped sleeping through the night. Not because of alarms, but because they began dreaming of things they couldn't remember. When asked, they described only a color. Not red, not black. Something between. Pilots refused night shifts. The auto-dock system kept resetting coordinates, as if something was whispering new numbers into the nav beacons. No one was injured. No one vanished. But trust cracked. And cracks widened. Within 3 weeks, the guild supervisors began pulling personnel out without authorization. They didn't consult the Republic. They didn't ask the Jedi. They just left cargo half unloaded, left manifest logs incomplete, left everything. The Republic sent a mediator. Her name was Solon Maris, a junior attaché with no combat background, chosen not for her experience but for her calm. She didn't make it through her 3rd night on the moon, not because anyone hurt her, because she walked into the rain without a coat, without a comlink, without saying a word. A storm was passing overhead. Lightning touched the perimeter fence. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, whispering something to herself. The guards who found her said she looked peaceful, until she turned to them and asked a question no one could answer. "Do you hear it breathing?" She was removed from duty the next morning, medically cleared, psychologically stable, but she never asked to return. Glovoc watched it all unfold through the Force. He didn't need cameras, didn't need reports. The silence told him everything. Belara no longer sang in the Force. It throbbed, uneven, faint, like a wound that refused to close. Kelros was worse. The mines had been unstable for decades, but the guild had adapted newer scaffolding, updated sensors, reinforced tunnels. But when the first collapse happened, it wasn't from equipment failure. It was from hesitation. A worker reported feeling something in the stone, not seismic activity, not air pressure. Awareness. He stopped drilling. His silence triggered confusion. The delay pushed another crew too far forward. The shift supervisor overcorrected. Support beams fractured, and everything caved. 12 died. The rest refused to return underground. The Jedi finally sent a knight. A calm one. Detached. Professional. He stayed on the surface for 6 days before departing without explanation. Glovoc didn't sense fear in him. He sensed reverence, because the knight hadn't seen chaos. He'd seen order dissolving itself. Vault was the last to fall. Its fuel stations were automated. Minimal staff. No reported issues. No formal breakdowns. Just silence. One by one, the communication relays stopped transmitting. Power usage remained constant. Oxygen levels remained stable. No requests for extraction. No response to pings. When Republic ships arrived, they found the stations intact. But the crews weren't waiting. They were sitting in the dark, every single one of them, not asleep, not restrained, just sitting, as if waiting for something to return. The med teams found no injuries, no toxins, no evidence of corruption. Only one anomaly. Each crew member had sealed their own helmet from the inside, even in their own ships, even with breathable air. As if they didn't feel safe anymore, even in silence, especially in silence. The systems had not been attacked, they had not been conquered, but something had been taken from them. The feeling that someone would come, the belief that someone would help, the illusion that anyone was in control. And Glovoc never raised a blade. He only whispered into the cracks already there. Victory didn't arrive with applause. There were no banners, no surrender, no declaration of conquest. It came in the form of silence. 3 systems disconnected from each other, not physically, but emotionally. The supply routes went dark. The guilds withdrew. The Jedi stepped back, not because they lost, because they didn't understand. Fear had spread so deeply through the infrastructure that no one wanted to be responsible anymore. Meetings were postponed. Orders left unsigned. Holonet coverage shifted to larger priorities. Systems that once hummed with traffic now buzzed with empty static. Glovoc stood in the viewing chamber of the abandoned orbital platform and watched. Not through windows, through the Force. It pulsed differently now. Not just in him, in everything. As if the balance had accepted his presence. Not welcomed it, but acknowledged it. He wasn't like the Sith Lords of old. They wanted obedience. He wanted proof. Proof that the galaxy could be undone without fire. And now, he had it. He didn't leave marks, didn't leave scars. Only questions. What had happened? Why had it started? Who was responsible? No answers. And that was the point. When power is unseen, it lasts longer. The Jedi finally issued a statement. Not to the public, to each other. A quiet communiqué circulated among senior masters warning of a growing disturbance not tied to any known faction. They described it as a passive fracture, something not malevolent but corrosive, an erosion of peace. They didn't mention his name, because they didn't know it. Not really. They had seen him once, a boy in the dark, a mistake left behind. And now, they couldn't even agree on what he was. Some believed he was a rogue Sith. Others suspected a Force nexus had gone rogue. One master argued the systems had simply failed due to poor planning. But none of them went back. None dared investigate again. Because something inside them, something older than logic, warned them not to. Glovoc didn't celebrate. He didn't feel triumph. He felt confirmation. That fear was a sharper tool than violence. That silence lasted longer than fire. And that war could be won without ever being declared. He returned to the cave briefly. The same one where he had first erased his name. The marks were still there, faded, but real. The circle on the wall had begun to close not by his hand, but by time. As if the cave itself remembered the path he walked. He didn't add to it. Didn't leave a new message. He sat for a full day in darkness, eyes open, feeling the galaxy shift around him. He sensed systems adjusting, adapting, creating new maps, rerouting supplies, avoiding the broken regions, pretending they never mattered. They would heal, but not completely. Because now they knew. Peace was not guaranteed, and safety was a choice others could break. He left the cave without ceremony, without vision, without purpose, because he didn't need one anymore. He had proven it. He didn't need an army. He didn't need a fleet. He didn't need to lift a weapon. He just needed to understand where the Force was weakest, and press. No one celebrated him. No one feared him by name. But across 3 systems, in empty hallways, dim control rooms, and locked starships orbiting lifeless moons, there was a presence now. Not a ghost. Not a god. Just something you hoped wasn't listening. And when people asked what had happened, the only answer they received was silence. He wasn't supposed to be there. The report called him a Jedi general assigned to border observation. Not a knight. Not a master. Just a newly promoted officer, sent to investigate the systems no one wanted to talk about. A show of confidence. A gesture to keep rumors quiet. But Glovoc felt it the moment the ship arrived. Not through scanners. Not through the Force. Through memory. There was something in the way the vessel slowed as it approached. How it paused before entering orbit. Like the pilot wasn't sure whether to proceed or turn back. Glovoc didn't sense hesitation. He sensed recognition. The Jedi came alone. Not out of arrogance. Out of purpose. He touched down on Kelros where the mines had long since been abandoned, the tunnels still poisoned by the ritual Glovoc had left behind. Republic recon drones had failed to land safely. Droids lost signal within minutes. No one had stepped foot there since the collapse. But the Jedi did. And Glovoc watched from a distance, standing atop the fractured ridge line beneath the cover of dust clouds that never stopped moving. He didn't attack. He didn't run. He waited. He needed to see the man up close. When the Jedi emerged from the tunnel entrance, Glovoc felt the shift in the Force. Not a tremor, not a warning, just presence. Raw, young, controlled, but barely. His stance was tight. Shoulders squared. One hand never left the hilt at his side. He was ready for violence, but not for what he would find. Glovoc stepped into view without effort. He didn't wear armor, no mask, just the same dark robes worn from dust and movement. His hands were open, his eyes steady. The Jedi froze. Their eyes met across the distance. And Glovoc felt something he hadn't felt in years. Familiarity. Not with the face, not with the voice, with the silence. The same silence he had known once after the mines, after the collapse, after the Jedi left him behind. It lived behind this boy's eyes. The Jedi ignited his saber. Green, brilliant, bright against the gloom. He didn't speak. He charged. The duel should have ended in seconds. Glovoc had studied forms that hadn't been practiced in generations. He knew how to shape the Force like water to bend motion, disrupt rhythm, pull momentum from others, and use it as his own. But the boy kept up. Each strike was desperate, but not clumsy, improvised, but not unfocused. He moved like someone who had survived more than he was trained for, someone who knew how to hurt and how to keep standing. The blades clashed at the edge of the cliff. Sparks flew, dust swirled. The Force pulsed around them, not roaring, but watching. The Jedi slipped twice. Glovoc didn't strike, not because he couldn't, because something held his hand back. The boy shouted something, but Glovoc didn't hear it. He only saw the fire in his eyes, the same fire he once had, before it was taken, before it was reshaped into silence. The boy pressed forward, blade humming, sweat running down his temple. His strikes weren't meant to kill. They were meant to prove something. To himself, to Glovoc, to the galaxy. And Glovoc realized the truth too late. He wasn't fighting the Jedi. He was fighting what he used to believe in. The Jedi should have fallen. He slipped on fractured stone, his boot catching on exposed ore, body dropping low enough for a killing strike. Glovoc had the angle, the reach, the timing. One step forward, and it would have ended. But he didn't take it. Not because of mercy. Because of curiosity. He wanted to see what the boy would do next. The saber came up in a sudden arc. Not graceful, but fast, desperate. Glovoc leaned back, letting it pass inches from his neck. The heat kissed his skin. He could feel the pulse in the blade's core, strong, steady, alive. The boy didn't retreat. He pressed forward again. And Glovoc felt something impossible. The Jedi wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting not to lose himself. Each strike was a confession, a scream buried inside motion. He wasn't here on orders. He wasn't here for diplomacy. He had come to face something. Something he didn't understand. Something the Force had shown him in fragments, dreams, echoes, warnings too soft to be named. And he had followed those pieces until they brought him here. To Glovoc, to the wound beneath the silence. Their blades locked near the edge of the cliff, hands pressed tight against hilts, eyes locked. The rain began to fall again. Faint drops carried on wind, whispering against stone. The boy's jaw clenched. Glovoc saw it then. The flicker. A memory, not his own, bleeding through the Force. The boy had once been in the same camp, Ord to Lavos, a recovery center. Years ago, not in the same room, not in the same corridor, but close enough. He'd heard the silence. He'd heard about the boy who never spoke, the one who disappeared. And somehow, even now, he remembered. You were there, the Jedi whispered, breathless. Glovoc didn't answer, because it didn't matter. What mattered was the crack forming in the boy's anger, the shift from confrontation to connection. The force surged, not violent, not loud, just full, as if it, too, remembered. And Glovoc felt something in his chest tighten, not pain, not fear, recognition. The same kind that once pulled his hand back from finishing a fight. The same kind that stopped him from destroying a holocron just because it hurt. The same feeling that had no place in power, but refused to leave. The boy broke the lock. He spun left, low, sweeping the blade toward Glovoc's legs. Glovoc leapt over it, pivoted, reached out with the force not to kill, but to push. The wave sent the boy flying backward into the rock wall. His saber skidded across the dirt. Glovoc approached slowly. The boy sat up, blood on his lip, eyes defiant, not begging, not afraid. I'm not afraid of you, he said. Glovoc tilted his head. Then you're the only one. The boy wiped his mouth. You're not what they think you are. Glovoc paused. And what do they think I am? The boy stood. A Sith. Glovoc stepped closer. And what do you think I am? The answer came quickly. Lost. Silence. Not the kind that falls between breaths. The kind that marks the moment before something ends. Glovoc raised his hand. The boy closed his eyes. And Glovoc didn't strike. He let the force build in his palm, then vanish. Because he couldn't do it. Not because he lacked power, but because something inside this boy refused to break. And Glovoc didn't want to be the one to change that. Not this time. He had walked away from battles before. Left bodies behind. Let systems fall. Watched worlds unravel without blinking. But this was the first time he walked away from someone still standing. The Jedi didn't chase him. He stood beneath the edge of the cliffs, soaked in rain, saber still lost in the dust. His body didn't move. His gaze followed Glovoc, not with fear, but with something else. Understanding. That was what made it worse. Glovoc moved through the rock fields slowly. The force didn't pulse, didn't scream. It felt like a wound freshly closed, too raw to be touched. His breathing was steady, but his thoughts were not. He kept hearing the boy's voice, not the words, the tone, like someone who wasn't fighting a Sith, but trying to reach someone buried underneath. He hated how much that echoed. He made it back to his ship in silence. It was buried deep beneath the surface, a stealth vessel designed to avoid detection, its power core quiet, its systems passive. No lights, no sound, just space. He sat in the cockpit for hours, not meditating, not healing, just listening. But there was nothing to hear. No reports, no alerts, no alarms from the Jedi Order, no fleet movement, no pursuit. The Jedi hadn't told anyone. He'd kept the encounter to himself. Why? Was it fear? Or something else? Glovoc leaned back in the seat, eyes half closed, and let the memory play again. The fight, the blade, the stance, the way the boy moved. He fought like someone who didn't want to win, only to prove he wouldn't lose. That was familiar, too familiar. He remembered standing in a corridor with no light, a stun baton in his hand, asked to harm someone weaker and refusing. He remembered striking back against the instructor not for vengeance, but for clarity. He remembered being watched, judged, told that disobedience was dangerous, and he remembered choosing to walk away anyway. The boy had done the same. He wasn't afraid to stand alone, and that made him dangerous, but it also made him worth remembering. Glovoc didn't often think in names. Names faded, slipped away, became meaningless when worn too long. But something about the boy's presence wouldn't let go, like a sound that didn't echo, but stayed. Not a threat, not a rival, a reflection of what might have been. If someone had reached him in time, if someone hadn't walked away. The Force didn't speak during that reflection. It simply lingered, waiting. Glovoc knew what it meant. This wasn't over. The boy would return. Maybe not soon. Maybe not even in this cycle of war. But he would come back. Not for revenge, for truth. He would want to know why Glovoc spared him. Why the darkness hesitated. Why the silence hadn't crushed him. And Glovoc didn't know what he would say, because he wasn't sure himself. The boy reminded him of the moment before he chose solitude, before he turned away from masters, before he carved his own path in bloodless silence. A time when there was still the possibility of another way. He thought he'd buried that possibility, but now it stood before him. Green blade, fractured breath, unbroken stare. He wasn't sure if that meant hope or danger. He only knew one thing. When he looked into the boy's eyes, he didn't see the Jedi. He saw himself. Before everything burned, he didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, because the Force wouldn't let him. It moved around him like a cold wind, brushing against his thoughts, stirring old memories he had buried so deep he no longer recognized their shapes. Not visions, not warnings. Just fragments, a heartbeat in the dark, a voice he once forgot, the feeling of a hand slipping away in silence. He tried to push it back. The Force didn't obey. It showed him the cliff again. The shattered stone beneath his feet, the rain clinging to the Jedi's face. It replayed the moment not as combat, but as choice. The choice he made, the one he couldn't explain. Why didn't he kill him? Why didn't the darkness move through him the way it always did? Why did he hesitate? He walked to the edge of the ridge, letting the wind tear against his robes. The world below was quiet, a graveyard of abandoned tunnels and broken machines. A place shaped by fear, then forgotten by time. One of many. He stared into the emptiness and remembered the boy's last words. Lost. It should have meant nothing. An insult. A guess. A child trying to hurt a monster he didn't understand. But it stayed with him like a scar that refused to close. Because the boy wasn't wrong. Not completely. Glovoc had rejected masters, teachings, and futures. He had torn his name from memory, erased everything that tied him to anyone. He had become a shadow as a form of protection, not from the Jedi, not from the Sith, but from the person he once was. And now a boy he couldn't kill had dragged that person back into the light. He hated it, but he couldn't silence it. He turned away from the ridge and returned to his ship. The cockpit lights stayed dim, responding to his presence like a creature trained to remain obedient. He activated the hollow screen, expecting quiet. Instead, it flickered. A transmission, encrypted, anonymous. Not Republic, not Sith. A raw channel used for distress calls, untraceable by standard nets. Static bled across the image. Then a voice, young, shaking, trying to sound stronger than it felt. "We know you're out there." Glovoc didn't move. "We don't know your name. We don't know what you want. But we felt you. Across the tunnels, in the mines, in the silence." He knew that voice. one of the Kelros survivors, a child who had lived through the collapse. "We're not afraid," the voice said. "A lie. But we want to understand." The transmission ended. No coordinates, no signature, just silence. Again, always silence. He could ignore it, leave the message unanswered. Let the systems continue to unravel. Let the boy who survived him fade into a future that didn't involve him. He could disappear again, deeper into the places no one dared to look. But something inside him shifted. A memory he didn't choose. A woman's arms around him in the dark. A heartbeat slowing. A name he could no longer recall. The scar that the Force wouldn't heal. He closed his eyes. Not to meditate. To hide. From the truth, he wasn't ready to speak aloud. The Jedi boy wasn't a threat. He was a reminder of everything Glovoc had tried to silence. The console dimmed, the wind outside calmed. The galaxy returned to its quiet rhythm, unaware that a path had just forked, one that would pull Glovoc closer to his past, whether he ran or not. He exhaled, slow, uncertain. For the first time in his life, the silence didn't feel like protection. It felt like exposure. He didn't know the ritual would fail. Not completely, but somewhere beneath the preparation, beneath the glyphs and the silence and the exact rhythm of breath, there had been uncertainty. Not fear, not hesitation, just the smallest crack in confidence. And for rituals like this, one crack was enough. It had taken months to prepare. Not to find the place the tomb was already buried beneath a system swallowed by storms, but to understand what the ritual truly asked. It wasn't about summoning, not power, not memory, not even spirits. It was about separation, a means of anchoring one's will outside the body. Not projection, not illusion, something deeper. A technique once recorded by a Sith who vanished before the rule of two, whose name had been scratched off her own holocron. She believed the flesh was a distraction, that the Force could be wielded more clearly when the self was broken into pieces and moved beyond pain. It wasn't immortality, it was escape. He drew the sigils into the stone with a blade made from his own blood. He marked the ground with circles layered in sequences. No Sith since Korriban had spoken aloud. He fasted for 3 days, cut his breath into intervals until his heart followed the same rhythm. He did everything exactly as the ritual demanded. Except one thing, he didn't let go. Not fully. Some part of him, small, quiet, buried beneath years of isolation, held on. Maybe to the memory of the Jedi boy. Maybe to the silence that had always protected him. Maybe to the scar the Force had never healed. But he didn't release himself. And the ritual punished him for it. He didn't scream. There wasn't time. The Force buckled. Not in light. Not in darkness. Just pressure. A collapse inward. Like gravity folding around his ribs. His lungs failed first, not from impact, but from absence. He couldn't feel them. Couldn't feel the breath he had just taken. His spine bent backward. Something broke. Not bone. Something deeper. His vision cracked. He saw every version of himself, the boy in the mine, the shadow in the cave, the silence in the war, and they screamed back at him, not in pain, but in warning. Then it ended. Not with an explosion. With stillness. He awoke lying against the cold tomb floor, face pressed against stone slick with his own sweat. He couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Could barely think. But he could feel everything. His skin pulsed with pain. Not sharp. Smeared. Like fire stretched across every nerve, unable to burn out. He reached for the Force. It flickered. There, but dim. responsive but distant, like trying to lift a voice through water too deep to swim. He had severed part of himself, but not cleanly. And now, the wound wasn't spiritual. It was physical. His muscles spasmed without command. His fingers curled until joints cracked. His mouth opened to breathe, but no air came until the second try. He had survived, but not whole. Not anymore. He dragged himself from the tomb using his forearms, his legs too stiff to obey. The light outside blinded him. The wind tore at skin too raw to protect itself. Every movement screamed. Every breath tasted of iron. But he didn't turn back, couldn't. Because he knew the truth. This ritual hadn't killed him. It had just removed the illusion that his body belonged to him. And now, it was breaking. Slowly, irreversibly. He wasn't afraid of death, but for the first time, he began to fear staying alive. Pain didn't leave him. It waited. At first, he believed it was just the aftermath of the ritual, a punishment for failing to separate his essence cleanly. Sith rituals often demanded recovery. Days of weakness, nights of darkness. He had survived those before, but this was different. The pain didn't fade, it settled. It learned. Every step tore through him like hidden wires pulling at his bones. Every breath stung as if something sharp sat inside his lungs. His back felt twisted, like his spine had been rearranged by hands that didn't understand the shape of a human body. He tried to meditate. He tried to center himself, but the force no longer wrapped around him the way it once had. It felt distant, not gone, not broken, just farther away, like it had retreated from his skin, unsure whether he was still whole enough to touch. He wasn't dying. He could feel that clearly. Something in the ritual had embedded itself into him. A fragment, a hook, a sharp thread woven into the center of his being, tugging whenever he tried to focus. The Sith called it spirit shearing, a tearing not of flesh, but of connection when the physical form and the force slipped out of alignment, refusing to move together. It had happened before, in old wars, to masters who pushed themselves beyond what bodies were meant to handle. They usually didn't live long, but Glovoc did. And that was the problem. He tried to walk across the rocky surface of the tomb world. The ground tilted beneath him. His legs trembled. His hand brushed against stone for balance, and pain shot through his arm like lightning, forcing him to gasp. He fell, not gracefully, just collapsed. Dust rose around him as he hit the ground, hands scraping against the surface. He stayed there. Not because he chose to, but because his body stopped listening. Every twitch of muscle felt wrong. Every pulse of blood felt like a bruise expanding beneath the skin. He lay there for hours. The sky grew darker. The wind shifted. No one came. He was alone with the pain. Eventually, he forced himself upright again. Using the force didn't help. It trembled weakly inside him, unwilling to take shape. He had to rely on muscle memory, balance, breath, and each of those had become enemies. When he finally reached the shelter of a cave, night had fallen. He pressed his back against the wall and slid down, breath ragged. His fingers flexed without command, trembling as if electricity ran through them. He closed his eyes and saw nothing but red. Not visions. Vessels bursting beneath the skin. He touched his neck. The veins were raised, thick, hot. The ritual had done more than shear him. It had changed the shape of him. He tried to stand again, failed. Tried to speak. Nothing came out. He curled his fingers into the stone floor, forcing air into his lungs until his body remembered the pattern. He had always endured pain. As a child, as an apprentice, as a wanderer. It had been familiar. A companion. This was not familiar. This was violation. He wasn't afraid of injury, or scars, or loss. But this pain didn't feel like it came from outside. It felt like something inside him was trying to escape. He felt skin tighten across his ribs. He felt tendons pull against each other. He felt his heart beating too loudly, as if trying to break free. He pressed his forehead against the stone, breath shallow, hands trembling uncontrollably. This was not a wound. This was a prison. And for the first time since childhood, Glovoc understood the truth. He was trapped inside his own flesh, not as punishment, as consequence. The ritual hadn't saved him. It had not freed him. It had only begun to rewrite him. And the process had not finished, not even close. He had to bind himself, not as protection, as structure. The muscles in his legs no longer responded with consistency. His right shoulder spasmed at random intervals, locking his arm at the worst possible moments. His skin cracked from heat that came from nowhere, heat that rose from inside, as if his blood no longer obeyed temperature. He couldn't heal it. Not through meditation, not through rest, and not through the Force. The connection had grown thin. Not severed, not silent, just detached, as if the Force was still there but unwilling to touch him directly, like it didn't know what he was anymore. So he improvised. He returned to the cave where he'd hidden spare gear scavenged from corpses, old temples, broken stations. Bits of armor, fractured plating, synth leather gloves from a Sith enforcer who once tried to kill him. Nothing matched. Nothing was clean. That didn't matter. He wrapped the armor around his ribs first, not to shield them, but to hold them in place. The pressure helped. The pain didn't leave, but it became predictable, less chaotic. He added braces next, not just for his forearms, but all the way up to the shoulder, interlocking rings to keep the muscle from tearing when it spasmed. He strapped the left tighter than the right. His hand still shook when it moved, but at least it moved. The legs were worse. The thigh muscles had begun to knot. Uncoiling them with the Force had stopped working. He resorted to pressure rods, tied into the knees, locked by tension bands. He limped when he walked. But the limp had rhythm. He could work with rhythm. He didn't speak while he worked. There was no one to speak to. Only breath. Armor. Cloth soaked with blood. He no longer remembered shedding. He wrapped his neck last. The veins had thickened further. He couldn't tell if it was inflammation or something worse. The skin looked bruised, but it wasn't from impact. It was like something beneath the surface was growing slowly, patiently, waiting. He stared at himself in the reflection of a broken mask. The face was still his, but no longer familiar, not broken, changed, not burned, redefined. The eyes looked older than they should have. Not in years, in exhaustion. He chose not to wear a full helmet. Not yet. He wanted to remember what his face looked like while it was still his to recognize. But he reinforced the chest plate. It had to be precise. Not for protection against attack, but because the pressure against his ribs was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. Without it, he couldn't stand longer than an hour. The armor became his breath, his spine, his posture. It became his shape. Not because he wanted it, because he needed it. He left the cave without words. The weight of the gear slowed him, but the rhythm kept him upright. He moved like someone who had trained in gravity twice as strong. Every motion was measured, deliberate, bound in iron, not fury. The people who would meet him in the future would think it was intimidation. But it wasn't. It was survival. He didn't build a new identity. He built a brace for the one falling apart. The armor wasn't Sith. It wasn't sacred. It was a coffin he could still walk in, a prison he could still command, a warning to the galaxy that he was still here, even if the body inside was no longer whole, even if the soul inside wasn't sure what it was anymore. He learned quickly that pain had a rhythm, not a cycle, not a pattern, a rhythm, like something inside him was breathing on its own, separate from his lungs, separate from his heartbeat. Some days it pulsed gently, a quiet throb behind the ribs. Other days, it surged through his limbs like fire poured into veins not made to carry it. He stopped trying to fight it. Fighting meant wasting strength, and strength was the one thing he could not spare. The armor helped, but it wasn't enough. Each plate held a part of him together, but not the parts that mattered. His thoughts had begun to slip. Not memories, not identity, something deeper. The sense of self. He felt it first when walking across the ruins of the outer ridge. His body moved, but something felt delayed, as if a fraction of him stayed behind with each step. Not physically, spiritually. Like he was leaving pieces of himself scattered across the terrain. He tried to call them back. The force did not respond. It lingered at the edge of awareness, cold and distant, present but unreachable. Like a voice speaking from behind a wall he couldn't break. He wondered if this was the price. Not pain, not decay, dissolution. The ritual had tried to separate him. It had failed to finish. And now he walked in a half-state, anchored to flesh that no longer fit him, tethered to a force that no longer recognized him cleanly. He sat on a jagged stone outcropping, armor grinding as he lowered himself. The wind cut against the exposed gaps in the plating, scraping the skin beneath. He didn't flinch. He couldn't tell if he still felt the worst parts, or if he'd grown used to them. He looked at his hands, trembling, small spasms, faint but constant. He closed them into fists. They shook harder. He released them. They shook still. A quieter man might have cried. A weaker one might have begged the Force for help. A Sith would have raged. A Jedi would have searched for meaning. Glovoc did none of those things. He simply breathed through the distortion. Pain was not new, but this was transformation. Something inside him was rewriting the shape of him slowly, unwillingly, relentlessly. Not to kill him, not to strengthen him, to prepare him. For what? He didn't know. He tried to sleep. He couldn't. The moment his eyes closed, his body twitched violently, forcing him awake. Muscles misfired. Limbs jerked on their own. His spine arched involuntarily, armor grinding against stone. He forced himself flat. The pain didn't fade. It hovered. Waiting, he stared into the dark and wondered if this was what immortality actually felt like. Not power, not eternity. Just an endless reminder that the body was temporary and the soul was not meant to be tethered to it forever. He finally understood the message of the ritual's creator. Immortality was not prolonged life. It was refusal. Refusal to end. Refusal to release. Refusal to let the self dissolve. And those who survived such rituals weren't blessed. They were trapped. He stood again at dawn, armor creaking as joints protested. The sky was dim with dust. The sun barely a shape behind gray storms. He looked at the horizon, breath uneven, thoughts heavy. He wasn't dying. He wasn't living either. He was becoming something in between, something the Sith once feared, something the Jedi could never heal. A being held together by will alone. He took one step forward. The pain followed. He took another. The flesh resisted. He took a third. The Force trembled not in rejection, not in welcome, but in recognition. Whatever he was becoming, it was not finished, and the galaxy had no name for it yet. He didn't expect the Jedi to come back. Too much time had passed. Systems had collapsed. Fear had shifted into myth. The ritual scars still burned beneath his armor. His breath was still fractured. His name had faded into shadow. But the Force does not forget what matters. And neither did he. The report came quietly, buried in the outer channels of a Republic relay. A lone Jedi general had passed through Vault's outer rim. No fleet, no escort, no mission logged, just a pattern. It was the same signature, the same ship. The boy had grown into a man, and now he was searching again. Glovoc stood at the edge of an observation platform above the silent crater of the dead world. The wind carved across the stone like blades dulling against age. His armor creaked with every breath. His joints resisted stillness. But something else stirred beneath all of it. Something not felt in years. A pulse. He remembered the boy's eyes, how they didn't break. The voice that didn't tremble. The presence that refused to kneel. He hadn't forgotten that fight, not because it wounded him, but because it left a question unanswered. What would the boy become? And now, that answer was approaching from the stars. No ambush this time. No hunt. No trap. The Jedi sent word ahead. A message, broadcast on an open frequency, Glovoc had stopped monitoring long ago. I don't come to fight. I come to finish the conversation. No threats, no challenges. Just truth. It was not bait, not strategy. It was faith. The kind only Jedi still believed in. And Glovoc hated that it worked. He didn't pace. He didn't prepare. He simply stood where the signal was strongest. Let the ship find him. Let the silence hold. When the Jedi stepped from the vessel, he was no longer the boy from before. He was taller, worn. The kind of worn that doesn't come from combat, but from years of holding back the collapse of things no one else saw. His robes were marked with dust, his saber untouched. His eyes carried the same fire, but quieter now. Older, still watching everything. The two stood in the dust between the ship and the ridge. No weapons drawn. No distance closed. The Jedi spoke first. You remembered me. Glovoc didn't answer, because it didn't need to be said. The Jedi continued. I tried to forget. I told myself you were a warning, that I should have stopped you, that sparing you was weakness. Glovoc tilted his head. And now, the Jedi looked down, breath slow. And now, I wonder if it was the only thing I've done that mattered. Silence followed, not hostile, heavy. The kind of silence that settles in rooms where grief has not yet been named. Glovoc stepped forward, just once. You came to die. The Jedi met his gaze. No, I came to offer something. Another pause. Glovoc's hands didn't move. The armor hissed faintly as it adjusted under the strain of the wind. The Jedi took a breath. There's something left in you. Something you want to save. No, the Jedi said. Something I want to understand. And Glovoc, for the first time in years, felt the silence break, not from outside. From within, a crack, small, dangerous, alive. The wind didn't shift, but something else did. The Jedi didn't ignite his saber. Glovoc didn't reach for the Force. The tension between them wasn't built on fear or power. It was built on memory, shared, but never spoken. They walked together not side by side, but near enough that their footsteps fell into rhythm. No words. Not yet. The slope beneath them led to a broken plateau. once part of an abandoned Sith excavation site. Nothing remained but pillars and half-buried codes etched in languages no longer spoken aloud. Glovoc stopped at the edge of one such pillar, armor creaking as he shifted his weight. The Jedi stood across from him and waited. Finally, Glovoc spoke. "Why come back?" The Jedi looked up, eyes scanning the horizon before returning to the man behind the metal. "Because I was wrong." Glovoc raised a brow beneath the plating. "About what?" "That you were lost." Glovoc said nothing. The Jedi continued. "You weren't lost. You were wounded. Deeply. Slowly. And the galaxy watched it happen." Glovoc's voice lowered. "You came to heal me." "No." The answer came without delay. "I came to see if you could still feel anything worth healing." That made Glovoc laugh. Not loudly. Not mockingly. Just once. A dry breath that echoed like metal scraping stone. "You think I'm a scar that needs closure." "No," the Jedi said. "I think you're a door that hasn't closed yet." Silence returned, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like pressure. Like something just beneath the surface. Glovoc took a step forward. "This," he said, gesturing to the armor, to the world, to the air between them. "This isn't unfinished. It's all that's left." The Jedi didn't argue. He didn't try to prove anything. He simply lowered his head, eyes half closed. "And if that's true, then I came to stand in it. One last time. To see the man the galaxy forgot, before he becomes something else entirely." Glovoc felt the force shift. Not violently. Not with warning. Just opening. Like a wound starting to breathe. He hated it, and still, he didn't stop it. "You risk death for a conversation. I risk more by ignoring it." Glovoc studied him. The voice hadn't changed. Still calm, still steady. But it carried weight now. Years, loss, regret. A Jedi no longer young. A man who had learned too late how little he truly controlled. Glovoc turned away. Looked toward the horizon. His breath caught once not from pain, but memory. He remembered a cave. A circle drawn in stone. The promise he made to himself. Power bows to no one. But this wasn't bowing. This was something worse. Recognition. The Jedi stepped closer. Not with arrogance. Not with hope. Just presence. He sat down at the edge of the stone. Crossed his legs. Rested his hands on his knees. "I won't ask again," he said. "I won't return." "I know," Glovoc replied. The Jedi looked up. "Then sit with me." The invitation hung in the air. It didn't threaten. It didn't beg. It waited. Glovoc didn't move. Not yet. But he didn't walk away either. And for a moment, that was enough. Because sometimes, the Force doesn't speak through visions. Sometimes, it just opens a door, and waits to see who walks through it. He didn't sit at first. Not because he refused, because he didn't know how. The armor wasn't built for rest. Every plate was locked in a configuration meant for stability, not stillness. The joints ached. The spine rod pulled when he bent too far forward. The chest plate constricted when he breathed deeply. Still, he lowered himself to the stone. It wasn't grace. It wasn't ritual. It was surrender to the body he could no longer control. The Jedi didn't speak. He only nodded once. Quiet acknowledgement. Two figures, one wrapped in robes that had seen too much peace. The other entombed in armor that remembered only pain. And yet, neither moved. The wind passed between them, catching the edge of the cliff. Distant birds cried once before silence returned. Glovoc looked down at his hand. It shook faintly beneath the glove, a tremor he couldn't suppress anymore. His fingers had grown thinner over the years, not weaker, just hollowed. As if some part of him had already left. The Jedi noticed, didn't comment, didn't pity, and Glovoc was grateful for that. He hated pity more than pain. I never understood, the Jedi said quietly, why you didn't kill me. Glovoc didn't look up. Because I saw myself. The Jedi blinked. Not in you, Glovoc added. In your doubt. The words sat heavily in the air. The Jedi didn't argue. He stared out toward the canyon. I used to believe the code would protect me from fear, from making the wrong choice. But all it did was delay them. Glovoc's voice was low. Fear doesn't need time. It only needs a place to hide. The Jedi turned to him. I was afraid I failed you. You did, Glovoc said. But not the way you think. He finally met the Jedi's eyes. You didn't fail to save me. You failed to see me. There was no anger in his voice. No bitterness. Only a weight that had sat for too long in silence. The Jedi nodded once, and didn't deny it. He let the moment breathe. Glovoc didn't move. He couldn't. But the Force stirred around them. Not bright, not loud. Soft, curious, present. The kind of presence that didn't offer answers, only the chance to ask a question without fear. I remember the camp, the Jedi said. Ord Talavos. You were always quiet. You looked away. I wasn't ready, the Jedi admitted, to understand what silence meant. And now, I still don't know, the Jedi said. But I'm willing to listen. That broke something. Not loud. Just a sound in the armor. A soft hiss. Glovoc adjusted the mask slightly. Enough to let air pass into a chamber pressed too tightly against his jaw. The silence he'd built around himself was strong. But it wasn't seamless. The Jedi didn't push. Didn't move. Just waited. Glovoc stared at the horizon again. He didn't know how much longer he could sit like this. His legs were already locking. His chest ached beneath the plates. But he didn't stand. Not yet. Because for the first time since the ritual, the pain didn't feel alone. It wasn't healed. It wasn't shared. But it was witnessed. And that, somehow, changed its shape. He knew the moment couldn't last. Not because the Jedi would break it. Because his body would. The tremor in his hand grew worse. His breath tightened beneath the chest plate. A cold pulse climbed his spine. The same warning that came before a muscle seized or a joint locked. He shifted, armor grinding, trying to hide the movement. The Jedi noticed. Of course he did. You're in pain. It wasn't a question. Glovoc didn't deny it. He looked down at the metal wrapped around him. Pieces welded, strapped, forced into shape. Armor meant for battle, repurposed for survival. What once felt like protection now felt like a cage. Pain is familiar, Glovoc said softly. That doesn't make it less real. He turned his head slightly. Real is irrelevant. The Jedi studied him for a long moment. You think this is strength? Glovoc didn't answer. You think endurance is purpose, the Jedi continued. That holding yourself together is the same as being whole. Glovoc's jaw tightened beneath the mask. You see weakness where there is discipline. No, the Jedi said gently. I see discipline where there could be peace. That word, peace, it stung more than the pain. Glovoc's breath faltered. You speak of peace as if it exists. It does, the Jedi replied. But not the way the Order taught us. And not the way the Sith hunted for it. Glovoc looked away. The canyon stretched beneath them, barren, cracked, ancient. A place carved by centuries of storms. The Jedi stepped closer, only by a fraction. I didn't come to convert you, or save you. I came because you're carrying something no one else knows how to hold. Glovoc felt the Force shift again. Not a wave, just a ripple, a reminder. He could refuse. He could stand, strike, end this, bury the conversation beneath stone and silence and armor. He could return to his exile, to the ritual scars that rewrote him, to the solitude he understood better than breath. But the Jedi wasn't his enemy. He was a mirror, a painful one. Glovoc finally spoke. You came for truth. The Jedi nodded. Then here is truth, Glovoc said. I am dying. The Jedi didn't flinch. He didn't look away. How long? Long enough. And the armor? Without it, Glovoc whispered, I fall apart. The Jedi's voice was a breath. Then take it off. Glovoc froze. Silence fell hard. Cold, dangerous. He turned slowly. What did you say? The Jedi didn't step back. You said you're dying. You said the armor holds you together. Then take it off, Glovoc. If you fall apart, then maybe it's time. Glovoc's hands tightened. The metal groaned. You don't understand what you're asking. I do, the Jedi said. You've lived in pain so long you think it's identity. Glovoc felt heat rise beneath his ribs. Anger, fear, memory. He couldn't tell which. You ask me to die. No, the Jedi said. I'm asking you to choose. For once in your life, choose something other than survival. The Force pressed between them like breath. Slow, unavoidable. Glovoc's vision blurred. Not from weakness, from clarity. The truth was simple, terrifying, final. The armor wasn't keeping him alive. It was keeping him from letting go. His voice barely made sound through the mask. And if I choose wrong? The Jedi stepped forward. You already survived everything else. Survive this. A crack formed in the silence. Not in the air. In Glovoc. A fracture years in the making. He didn't remove the armor. Not yet, but his hand moved toward it. Slow, shaking, as if he were reaching not for metal, but for the person buried beneath it. He didn't vanish in battle. There was no explosion, no scream, no crashing starship to mark his end. There was only quiet. The kind of silence that settled so deeply into the bones of a place, even the Force hesitated to fill it. He walked into the canyons beyond Rionic's verge one last time, wrapped in cracked armor, limbs stiffer than before. The storm that had whispered through his chest for years had quieted, but it hadn't passed. It had sunk beneath the metal and flesh until he couldn't feel where it ended or where he began. He didn't leave a trail. No ships, no transmissions, no body. And yet, something lingered. The local children said they saw him a shape on the edge of the cliffs, unmoving, watching the stars long after suns fell. Miners whispered that their drills jammed near Sector 7, where the rocks pulsed with static and dread. A transport pilot once claimed he caught a glimpse of the Sith armor half buried in stone, arms outstretched, as if reaching for something that never came. But none of them knew what really happened. Only one man did, and he never told anyone. The Jedi, the one who found him once and spoke when no one else could. He returned to the canyon 5 days after Glovoc disappeared. No one asked why. He walked alone, robes caught in wind, the Force drawing him forward like gravity. He didn't search. He didn't call out. He simply moved until he stopped. There, beneath a red cliff shaped like a broken jaw, he found the mask. Just the mask. No body, no armor, Just the final piece of a man who had once drowned himself in silence, now left behind like an offering to the past. It wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't a grave. It was a choice. And in that moment, the Jedi realized something he hadn't understood before. Glovoc hadn't died. He had let go. Not to the Force, not to death, but to the name no one ever heard. Because before he vanished, before the last tremor left his hands, Glovoc had spoken. Once, alone, to no one. And the name he gave wasn't Glovoc. It was his own, the one stolen from him in childhood, buried beneath cult scars and Sith rituals, hidden behind obedience, armor, hatred. A name the galaxy never knew, and never would. Because the only person who heard it was the Force itself, and the Force does not speak. It remembers. The Jedi took the mask and left the canyon. He said nothing of what he found, not to the Council, not to the archivists, not to those who whispered about a Sith ghost in the cliffs. Instead, he kept walking, kept listening, because he knew that somewhere in the quiet between thoughts, in the gaps between systems, there would be an echo, not of battle, not of fear, but of a voice tired, quiet, human that once chose silence over vengeance. He never found the man again. But sometimes, when the wind shifted through the temples, and the children of the next generation asked about the Sith who wore silence like armor, the Jedi would say nothing. He would simply close his eyes and remember a voice that was never recorded, but always heard. The armor remained. That was the strange part. Not in the canyon, not on a body, but in stories, in fragments, in places it had never been. A month after the Jedi left the cliffs, a stolen freighter was intercepted above Duro. The pilot fled, but left behind a crate hidden beneath old ration packs and oxidized detonators. Inside was a pauldron, dark, cracked, with etchings not from any modern smith. Symbols only found in Sith rituals dating back to before the Great Hyperspace War. The artifact was catalogued, studied, then quietly sealed away. No name was listed on the file. Only coordinates. 2 years later, a Hutt cartel lord on Sleharen was assassinated by his own bodyguard. No footage captured it, but guards found something strange at the scene: a bootprint scorched into the durasteel floor. Too heavy for a normal sentient, but not for armor of ancient design. The assassin was never found. Only whispers. That he'd worn a mask once worn by a Sith who did not breathe, only watched. Then, 6 systems over, a diplomat's vessel malfunctioned near the Ison corridor. They were rescued by a scavenger ship operating without clearance. The crew never gave their names, but one of the diplomats swore she saw a figure in the hold, covered head to toe in dark plating, not moving, not blinking. Just there, watching, and then gone. Every few years, it happened again. A holocron vault breached. A Jedi outpost left standing but emptied of texts. A Sith relic retrieved before anyone else arrived. No casualties, no traces, only heat signatures that faded too quickly, and a single pattern the shape of a man wrapped in armor no one could trace, carrying no code, no identity, no weapon. Legends began to grow. Some said he was a Sith specter, a remnant of Darth Nihilus himself. Others believed he was a failed Jedi experiment, cast out for discovering truths not meant to be known. And there were those, in the darker corners of the underworld, who claimed he wasn't a man at all, that the armor had consumed its wearer, and now walked alone, seeking nothing, fearing nothing, just continuing. But the truth was simpler. and more painful. The armor outlived the man, not because it killed him, but because it carried what he couldn't let go. Each scar on its surface was a memory, a vow, a choice. It had been built not to protect, but to preserve. And when the name beneath it was finally spoken, when Glovoc gave himself back to the Force, to silence, the armor did not fall. It adapted. It continued, because even if the voice was gone, the myth had begun. And myths do not ask permission to survive. In Jedi halls, some still debated it. A few masters whispered of encounters, of glimpses in meditation, of presences they couldn't name but felt tied to something old. Not evil, not dark, just unresolved. They never wrote it down, because some truths couldn't be preserved in records, only in reverence and fear. The Jedi who once found Glovoc never confirmed any of the sightings. But once, decades later, he returned to the canyon. Alone again, older, slower, eyes dimmed by years. He stood in the same place and felt nothing. No presence, no force echo, no voice, only wind. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something. On the stone wall, just above where the mask had been found, a mark, scratched, faint, almost vanished. 3 letters, in a language almost lost. Not a name, not a warning, just a reminder. The armor had left, but something of the man remained. Myths never start with truth. They start with emptiness. And the emptiness Glovoc left behind was large enough for the galaxy to fill in on its own. The first stories came from traders, the kind who lived far from the core and closer to danger than law. They spoke of a figure standing atop wrecked stations, watching passing ships without moving. No weapons, no threats, just presence. Always wrapped in shadow, always armored. Then came the mercenaries, soldiers who fought in border disputes the Republic ignored. They whispered of a man who walked through battlefields untouched, as if blaster fire bent around him. They claimed he didn't strike, didn't speak, didn't even breathe loudly. He simply appeared in the corner of vision, turned his head, and vanished. None dared follow. On Kessel, prisoners spoke of him with fear. They said the tunnels sometimes grew silent, as if listening. And in that silence, a shape appeared at the edge of the lights, dark, patient, unmoving. Prisoners who tried to approach reported feeling cold. Some fainted. Others walked backward, without realizing they had moved. No one ever touched him. Some believed he wasn't real. Others were certain he was. Not a man, a memory. The myths evolved as all myths do. Each retelling polished a different truth, sharpened a different fear. Some said he fed on suffering. Others said he hunted only those who lied to themselves. One cult worshipped him as the husk of the Silent One, believing he carried the souls of the forgotten. But buried beneath every lie was something consistent. Silence. Legends say silence can kill, that it can swallow truth, that it can break a mind if held too long. The tales about Glovoc's armor grew because silence followed it everywhere, even where silence shouldn't exist. Deep space radio operators reported transmissions collapsing when the armor passed nearby. Whole frequencies dropped to static. Droids malfunctioned. Doors jammed. Sensors blinked with no explanation. Scouts said it felt like the air itself refused to vibrate. As if the galaxy held its breath. The Jedi Council took notice, but only briefly. The Order was stretched thin with conflicts that scattered its focus. A quiet anomaly in the outer rim meant little compared to the wars drifting toward the core. They recorded incidents, debated theories, then archived the information under unconfirmed. But not everyone forgot. Smugglers on Nar Shaddaa claimed the armor saved them once stepping between them and a gang enforcer, taking the blows without striking back. When they looked again, the figure was gone. Miners on Viscara swore they saw a dark shape pulling a child from a collapsed shaft. The child lived. The rescuer did not wait to be thanked. And yet, in the same year, a Sith warband in the Outer Rim was found dead in their stronghold. No burns, no wounds, no signs of combat. Just fear frozen in their faces. And at the center of the hole, burned into stone, a footprint, too heavy to belong to any living man. The myths contradicted each other. One version painted him a savior. Another called him a curse. The truth? He had become a mirror. People saw in the armor whatever they needed to see: a guardian, a punishment, a ghost, a warning. The galaxy hates a vacuum. It fills silence with stories. And Glovoc, who once fled his own voice, became louder in legend than he ever was in life. The Jedi General, the only one who knew the man beneath the armor, listened to these myths in quiet holes and shadowed corners. He never corrected them, never denied them. Because he understood something no one else did. Myths aren't meant to be accurate. They're meant to remember what people cannot bear to forget. And the galaxy could not forget the shape Glovoc left behind. Not a name, not a face, a shadow, still walking, still listening, still refusing to disappear. The Jedi didn't wear his robes anymore. Not the traditional ones, at least. Age had settled into his joints, softened his pace. The once vibrant blue of his rank had faded into gray, and the lightsaber at his hip rarely left its place. He was no longer sent on missions, no longer called to negotiate or command. But he remained, in the archives, in the meditation chambers, in the places where memory lasted longer than conflict. He was the only one left who had truly seen Glovoc, and he carried that truth like a wound that refused to scar. Others came to him, sometimes Padawans, scholars, even Jedi Masters, asking what he knew about the Silent One, or the Wraith in armor, or the Force-shrouded ghost. They brought datapads filled with speculation, holo recordings, sensor reports, witness statements, distorted and vague. He always listened, and then said nothing, not because he wanted to protect Glovoc, but because the galaxy wouldn't understand. They never had. To them, Glovoc had become a figure, not a person. A collection of stories, stripped of breath and blood. They could not imagine that beneath the legend was someone who had once laughed softly in the corner of a training yard, who had once flinched at loud voices, who had once stared at the stars not with ambition but with fear. The Jedi remembered all of it. He remembered the first time he saw Glovoc as a child, knees scraped, face unreadable. The way he never cried, the way he never looked away from pain. He remembered their last conversation, not a battle, not a debate, but a silence broken by a single truth neither of them could fully speak. And most of all, he remembered the canyon. Not the way it looked, but the way it felt, like something had ended there, something that hadn't made a sound. He had stood in that place long after Glovoc disappeared, not expecting a sign, just waiting, as if the Force itself might whisper an answer too delicate for words. It never did. But over the years, he found something else. Every time he walked the halls of the temple, every time he meditated with younglings, every time he stood beside those who feared falling, feared failing, feared being forgotten, he heard echoes, not of Glovoc's voice, but of his presence. The strength it took to remain quiet, the pain of carrying a name no one remembered, the burden of surviving without becoming cruel. The Jedi never told the Order about the canyon. He never told them about the final mark scratched into the stone. The 3 ancient letters that once meant something only Glovoc understood. He let it fade with time, because he knew the truth didn't need to be preserved in stone. It lived in the Force, and in him. He wasn't proud of how it ended. He wasn't sure it ended at all. But every night, before sleep, he whispered a name. Not out loud, not for anyone else, just once, in his thoughts. A name no record ever kept. A name Glovoc had only spoken to the stars. It was his way of remembering, of honoring what was lost without trying to fix it. Because Glovoc had not asked for redemption, he had not tried to be a legend. He had only wanted to be seen. And in the end, even if the galaxy forgot him, one man did not. The Jedi who remembered, not because it was his duty, but because some bonds survive silence, and some names do not need to be known, to never be forgotten. The fortress was never marked on any map. It did not rise from mountains or pierce clouds like the grand temples of the Sith. It had no towering spires, no obsidian statues. It was buried in the stone of a forgotten moon, dug so deep into the bedrock that even seismic scans missed it. And yet it breathed, not with wind, not with life, but with the slow exhale of presence. An ancient pressure that pressed against the mind, not the skin. No alarms, no lights. Just stillness so absolute that sound itself seemed to vanish at the threshold. For centuries, no one entered, but the fortress did not decay. Its doors remained sealed, but not corroded. Its corridors stayed clean, untouched by dust or mold, as if time was reluctant to claim it, as if something inside had claimed time instead. The force within its walls was not light or dark. It was silence, the kind that waits, the kind that listens. Some called it a tomb, others called it a vault, but those who came closest, those who felt it without stepping foot inside, understood something worse. It was neither. It was a wound, cut into the Force itself, a place where pain had been sealed away, not to be hidden, but to be preserved, not for remembrance, not for reverence, for return. Deep inside, beyond the first halls and the carved stone, there was a single chamber, round, perfectly symmetrical, its floor engraved with a pattern no record ever matched. At the center stood a pedestal, empty, or so it seemed. But if one stood too close for too long, thoughts began to change. Names faded, time slipped, and in the darkness, some heard footsteps where there were none. They called it haunted. They were right, because the fortress had never truly been abandoned, and whatever had once built it had never truly left. It was discovered by accident. A scavenger, too bold for his own good, pried it from the wreckage of a shattered Sith outpost. At first glance, it was just another relic, a red-trimmed holocron with weathered edges and faint etchings in a dialect few could read. But it was warm, not to the touch, to the mind. He carried it back to his ship, locked it in a containment case, and set course for a black market dealer on Rishi. He never made it. Some say his ship crashed. Others say it simply disappeared. But 2 cycles later, the holocron resurfaced. This time, in the hands of a warlord from the Mid-Rim, a self-declared prophet who claimed he could hear the voice of a Sith who never spoke. He built an altar around it, lit torches in every room. But by the end of the year, the warlord was found dead, not torn apart, not assassinated, but kneeling in silence. Eyes open, mouth stitched shut, and the holocron had vanished again. It moved without witnesses, Or perhaps those who witnessed it simply forgot. Because something in the holocron reached deeper than thought. It didn't glow like others. It pulsed. With each passing year, rumors spread across the outer rim. A cursed object, a Sith trap, a weapon that didn't kill, just changed the one who held it. But those who listened closely claimed something different. They said it didn't speak in words. It breathed. And if you breathed back, it remembered you. Within its latticework was not a lesson or a blueprint. No doctrine, no threat. Just silence encoded so precisely, it could pull stillness out of even the loudest minds. The Jedi Council denied its existence. The Sith cults tried to find it. But it belonged to neither. Because it did not teach power. It didn't even seek a student. It waited. And every time it opened, it listened first. Then, beneath the surface of thought, something ancient whispered. Not to control, not to guide, but to remind. He had never needed to speak, to be obeyed. They came in dreams first. Young acolytes, half-trained and easily broken, began to hear things that were not spoken aloud. Not commands, not visions, just impressions, pressure, cold, the sensation of watching without eyes. Many dismissed it as side effects of dark rituals. Others blamed hallucinations caused by old Sith poisons buried in their blood. But the ones who truly listened, the quiet ones, described the same thing. A voice that was not a voice. A presence without form. And a feeling they were being followed by someone who had already left. They started drawing patterns they'd never studied. Repeating words in dead languages they'd never learned. Most couldn't explain it. Some didn't survive it. But a few began to worship it. Not as a Sith Lord. As something older, darker, wiser. They called it the Hollow King. A figure who wore silence like armor and turned pain into prophecy. His teachings weren't passed down through texts. They were felt, experienced, and always alone. Entire covens formed around the idea that his return wouldn't be loud. It would begin with forgetting, and end with obedience. One acolyte cut out her tongue and claimed she could hear him more clearly afterward. Another sealed himself in an underground cell, refusing to speak, eat, or sleep until he died with a smile on his face. The Holonet never reported it. The Jedi archives never acknowledged it. But in forgotten corners of wild space, entire structures were built in his name, temples without entrances, shrines made of obsidian and bone, places that echoed without sound. They believed he was not gone, only waiting for the galaxy to become quiet enough to hear him again. And every year, the silence around his myth grew louder. Because there was no grave, no proof of death, only a question etched into every shadow that ever touched the dark side. What if power does not vanish when its voice goes silent? What if it listens, waits, and when the galaxy is weak enough, answers? The galaxy never agreed on what happened to him. Some said he ascended, that the ritual which broke his body finally completed itself centuries later, turning him into something the Force could no longer measure. Others believed he dissolved into the armor, a consciousness trapped inside metal, waiting for a worthy mind to open the seal. A few whispered a darker idea, that he never left, that the man died, but the silence remained. And silence, once born, does not die. On worlds far from the core, explorers sometimes reported a figure standing on cliff edges at dusk, unmoving, unbothered by storms, watching suns fall behind dead mountains. No scanners detected him. No footprints remained afterward. But those who saw him swore he wasn't a ghost. He was waiting. The Jedi general who once knew him grew old. Too old for missions, too old for war. But on his final night in the temple, he walked alone to the highest balcony, leaning on a cane carved from a branch of a felled convo tree. The air was thin, the sky quiet. He closed his eyes and whispered the name Glovoc once revealed to the stars, a name the galaxy never learned, a name even he barely remembered. And for a moment, just a moment, the wind stilled. The Jedi smiled, not in peace, but in recognition, because something answered. Not a voice, not a vision, just a presence, faint, distant, listening. He passed away hours later, peaceful and alone, his hand resting on the balcony rail as if still reaching toward something only he could feel. In the centuries that followed, the myths endured. They shifted, grew, faded, returned. But one truth outlived every story. Some Sith do not die, not because they escape death, but because they refuse to be forgotten. His fortress still breathes. His holocron still waits. And across the dark spaces between uncharted stars, something old listens for the one sound it never learned to release. A name, his name, spoken once, kept forever, echoing without end.